Welcome to Tudor England, a place where fashion didn't just make the man, it made his bankruptcy inevitable. The good news, the Wars of the Roses were finally over. The bad news, peace gave everyone way too much time to care about sleeves. After decades of bloodshed, Henry VII climbed onto the throne in 1485 with a crown that was more pawn shop special than royal heirloom. England was tired, broke, and held together by duct tape. But that calm after the storm created a new obsession: how to look rich enough that no one remembered you used to stab your neighbours for fun. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Henry VII was the Tudor family's accountant, cautious, frugal, and allergic to unnecessary spending. His court wore practical wool, dignified but unflashy, like a medieval business casual. But then came his son, Henry VIII, the walking, talking, turkey leg-chewing embodiment of treat yourself. If Henry VII was a spreadsheet, Henry VIII was a firework. And where his father wore dignity, Henry VIII wore diamonds. The Tudor court under him became the 16th century version of the Met Gala, except instead of fashion photographers, you had ambassadors taking notes on who had the biggest codpiece. To understand Tudor fashion, you must first understand that it wasn't about clothing, it was about hierarchy, theatre, and sheer competitive vanity. Every garment was a public announcement. The cut of your sleeve could whisper minor gentry or scream royal favourite. Clothes told people exactly who you were, how much power you had, and sometimes who you were sleeping with. Fashion was so political that dressing incorrectly could cost you more than embarrassment. It could cost you your life. Picture this: a grand Tudor banquet at Greenwich Palace. The hall glows with candlelight bouncing off polished silver and about 30,000 sequins. A nobleman walks in wearing crimson velvet doublets, gold thread embroidery, and pearls sewn directly onto his hat, because subtlety is for peasants. Another noble, dressed in muted brown, looks on with the same expression you'd give someone who just parked their gilded carriage across two spaces. In this world, underdressing wasn't modesty, it was social suicide. Fashion wasn't a hobby, it was a battlefield. Your opponent's armour, brocade, your weapon, an outrageous hat. And Henry VIII? He was the general commanding the war on good taste. His wardrobe was legendary, hundreds of doublets, cloaks and gowns, each one more extravagant than the last. The king was an influence before influencing existed. He understood that power wasn't just shown through armies and gold, it was displayed through the absurd length of one's sleeves. But make no mistake, this obsession didn't stop with royalty. The entire noble class caught the fever. It became an arms race of fabric and ego. Courtiers sold land, mortgaged estates, and drained fortunes to appear fashionable enough to be seen near the king. It was said that one noblewoman spent the equivalent of a small castle's value on a single gown, not because she needed it, but because her rival had one with slightly shinier pearls. It was a world where out of fashion meant out of favour, and out of favour meant out of luck, and probably out of a head. This wasn't helped by the Tudor love of display. Public life was performance art with gravy. Every procession, feast and joust was a costume drama where your outfit was both your armour and your resume. Henry VIII's court was filled with onlookers, rivals and gossip-hungry ladies who could tell your social rank by the shade of your hose. The Tudor elite didn't merely dress for the occasion, they were the occasion. The fabrics themselves were messages. Velvet meant wealth, silk meant you had connections, gold thread meant you had money to burn, or you soon would. Colours mattered too. Deep reds and purples screamed power because the dyes were rare and costly. Black was the most expensive of all, not for its sombre tone, but because producing a deep, even black required layers of imported dyes. It was the colour of control, the original power suit centuries before bankers stole the idea. Of course, while the nobles were draping themselves in imported luxury, The peasants were over here in itchy wool, wondering how much their lord's hat had cost compared to their annual rent. The Tudor hierarchy wasn't subtle. You could literally see it walking down the street. The higher your rank, the more fabric you were legally allowed to wear. And so, as the 16th century rolled on, the English nobility transformed into a parade of overdressed peacocks whose motto might as well have been, "Fake it till you foreclose it." But here's the twist. This obsession with fashion didn't just happen in a vacuum. It reflected something deeper, the Tudors' desperate need to project legitimacy. Henry VII had clawed his way to the throne with a very questionable claim, and his descendants were determined to look like they belonged. Every jewel, every embroidered rose, every inch of imported silk was a declaration. We are not pretenders. We are destiny wrapped in gold thread. In this glittering, debt-ridden circus, image was everything. The Tudor nobility learned that it wasn't enough to be powerful. You had to look powerful at every moment, even if it meant pawning your estate to buy another sleeve. And so England entered one of the most fashion-crazed centuries in history, a time when the mirror was mightier than the sword, and the wrong outfit could destroy your fortune faster than any war. The stage is steep, the runway is open. Welcome to the original Dress to Impress, where bankruptcy was just another accessory. In Tudor England, you weren't judged by your words, your deeds, or even your moral character. You were judged by your outfit. It was a world where power didn't just sit on a throne, it strutted through a great hall wearing 20 layers of brocade. The Tudor elite had perfected the art of social theatre, and clothing was its loudest form of dialogue. Every button, ribbon, and ruff whispered or screamed, "I'm richer than you, and I can prove it without saying a word." The Tudors understood something modern politicians and influencers still rely on. Appearance is authority. When Henry VIII or Elizabeth I appeared before their subjects, they didn't dress as mere mortals. They appeared as gods disguised in silk and jewels. Their clothes weren't fashion, they were propaganda stitched together with gold thread and arrogance. You see, this wasn't an era where individuality was celebrated. You didn't wear what you liked, you wore what your status demanded. The more important you were, the heavier your clothes became, literally. Nobles wore layers upon layers of fabric, so much that standing upright was a mild workout. Peasants could move freely, sure, but only because they weren't wearing half of France on their shoulders. Tudor hierarchy was visible in every stitch, and it ensured no one forgot their place. Let's put it this way. Your clothing was your resume, your bank statement, and your social media profile all at once. Walking through London, everyone could tell exactly who you were based on what you wore. Velvet? You're probably a lord. Satin? You're a knight, or at least pretending to be one. Wool? Ah yes, good day, commoner. Linen? Servant class, and keep moving, no eye contact, please. The Tudor wardrobe was so codified that people could navigate society just by glancing at someone's sleeves. Why such obsession with clothing as a social marker? Because England in the 1500s was terrified of blurred lines. The Tudors had come to power after a messy civil war that toppled kings and shuffled noble families like a deck of cards. Suddenly war. The old world order was unstable. The newly rich merchant class was starting to dress like aristocrats. Panic ensued. What if everyone started looking equal? How would anyone know who to bow to? Tudor society solved this existential crisis the only way it knew how, with fashion regulations. Enter the sumptuary logic, an unspoken philosophy that clothes must match class, or chaos would follow. To the Tudors, it wasn't just a matter of taste, it was a matter of survival. Clothing reinforced the chain of command. You wore fine fabrics to show your power and obedience to the social order. It was a visual language of loyalty, a daily performance of hierarchy. Take the royal court, for example. Nobles didn't just show up in fancy outfits because they wanted to look good, they dressed strategically. The closer you were to the monarch, the more luxurious your clothes needed to be. A duke might wear cloth of gold, but heaven forbid a baron attempted the same without permission. To appear underdressed at court was social suicide. To appear overdressed was treason against the pecking order. It was a delicate balance. Think of it as trying to look expensive but not threatening, which is harder than it sounds when your doublet costs more than a small village. And this obsession trickled down the social ladder. Wealthy merchants began buying velvet coats to appear noble. Gentry families mortgaged their estates to afford imported silks, hoping to climb the social hierarchy by sheer fabric volume. Tudor society became a costume contest where the prize was recognition and the punishment was ridicule. The irony? The king himself was setting the example. Henry VIII wore garments so opulent that chroniclers described him as glittering like the sun. And when the sun shines, everyone else scrambles to sparkle just a little bit brighter. But the logic of clothes as class wasn't just about showing wealth, it was about enforcing obedience. The ruling elite believed that visible luxury kept people in line. If a peasant saw his lord shimmering like a gold mine, it reminded him of his place in the grand hierarchy of things. It was intimidation by embroidery. The upper classes were convinced that if the lower classes started wearing silks, they'd start asking dangerous questions like, "Why am I tilling your fields again?" Even colours had political weight. Royal blue and deep crimson were restricted to those with noble blood, as the dyes were astronomically expensive. Purple, the colour of imperial Rome, was reserved for royalty alone. Imagine trying to sneak into court wearing violet sleeves. That was a bold move right before losing your head. Even black, which we now think of as modest or sleek, was one of the most expensive dyes to produce. Only the richest could afford to mourn in style. Public visibility mattered too. Fashion was not for private pleasure but for display. The Tudors didn't get dressed to go about their day. They got dressed to be seen getting dressed. Royal processions, feast days, and even church services became fashion parades. People showed up not for spiritual enlightenment, but to count pearls on the Duchess's bodice. A noble's reputation lived or died by how he appeared in public. If your outfit didn't sparkle, neither did your prospects. The message was clear: wealth must be visible, or it didn't exist. Power wasn't something you whispered about. It was something you wore loudly enough to be heard across the hall. Even servants of the elite were dressed strategically, as walking billboards for their master's grandeur. A nobleman's household might spend an entire year's income on livery, matching uniforms that screamed, "My servants are better dressed than you." In short, Tudor fashion wasn't vanity. It was statecraft, psychology and performance art wrapped into one itchy, jewel-encrusted package. Everyone dressed for someone: the king, the court, the neighbours, or their own crippling insecurity, and every thread had meaning. In a society obsessed with rank, the most dangerous thing you could be was visibly ordinary. So if your outfit didn't say "I'm richer than you," then what was even the point of wearing pants that week? Imagine living in a world where your outfit didn't just say something about you, it could get you arrested. Welcome to Tudor England, where fashion wasn't just expensive, it was legally regulated. The government had a file on your wardrobe, and yes, it cared about your sleeves. These were the sumptuary laws, the Tudor crown's attempt to make sure no one dressed too fancy for their own good. It was the world's first and least glamorous version of know your place. On paper, these laws were about preserving moral order. In reality, they were pure paranoia stitched into statute. The Tudors, terrified that society might blur between noble blood and new money, decided to regulate clothing as if it were gunpowder. You could lose your head for plotting against the king, or for wearing silk when you weren't supposed to. Both were, apparently, national security concerns. The logic went something like this. If everyone started dressing rich, how would anyone know who actually was rich? England had just emerged from a century of civil war and political chaos, and the new Tudor dynasty was obsessed with stability, visual stability. Appearances mattered so much that Henry VIII and Elizabeth I both believed they could preserve hierarchy simply by controlling fabric. If your coat glittered too brightly for your social rank, that was considered a threat to the entire class system. Parliament began issuing detailed fashion decrees, pages upon pages outlining exactly what every social rank was allowed to wear. These weren't vague suggestions either. They read like a medieval shopping list from hell. None under the degree of a baron shall wear cloth of gold or silver. No man under the rank of knight shall wear velvet in his outer garments. Servants and labourers may wear only wool or russet cloth. And if you thought you could sneak in a little imported silk lining, think again. The law covered that too. The colour restrictions were even more absurd. Purple and crimson were reserved for royalty, while deep blue, black and scarlet were limited to the elite. The dyes themselves were incredibly costly, so banning them for commoners was both a power play and an economic shield. In essence, the Tudors said, "You can't wear what we can't afford to let you buy." Even fur was off limits to most. Sable and ermine were strictly for the upper nobility. Lesser gentry had to make do with fox or lambskin. The hierarchy extended right down to your cuffs, and enforcement was no joke. Inspectors, essentially fashion police, were known to report offenders. A merchant's wife caught wearing silk could be fined or humiliated publicly. Some chroniclers even mention confiscations. Imagine being stopped in the street, your fine cloak snatched away as contraband. Breaking the dress code could literally get you arrested. Imagine explaining to the sheriff that your sleeves were treason. "No, officer, I swear this is legal velvet. The good kind. Look, I have receipts." But here's the thing. These laws weren't just about class, they were about control. Henry VIII in particular understood that power had to look powerful. If the nobility began dressing like him, it would diminish his aura of divine authority. The king's image was sacred, so everyone else's had to be slightly worse. Likewise, the aristocracy feared that wealthy merchants, England's growing middle class, might buy their way into respectability through clothing. The sumptuary laws acted as a social firewall, ensuring that a tailor's son could never accidentally look like a duke. Behind the humour lay deep anxiety. The Tudor world was changing fast, trade was booming, urban centres were expanding, and merchants were becoming rich enough to challenge the old landed elites. The government's response: instead of redistributing wealth, it tried to redistribute fashion. It was, in essence, class warfare fought with fabric. Of course, enforcement was wildly inconsistent. Some nobles ignored the rules entirely, flaunting fabrics well beyond their degree. Wealthy merchants, emboldened by coin and ego, often did the same. Tailors were clever too. They learned to disguise contraband luxury under legal layers. You might have forbidden Italian silk hidden beneath a lawful wool outer coat. It was the Tudor version of bootleg couture, and everyone knew it. There's even evidence of people bribing officials to look the other way, or strategically marrying upward just to get better wardrobe privileges. In other words, social climbing sometimes started in the closet. You couldn't fake noble birth, but with the right doublet and a discreet tailor, you could fake noble vibes. The irony, of course, was that the crown's obsession with visual order only fueled more chaos. The very people meant to uphold the laws were often their worst offenders. Elizabeth I, for example, publicly enforced sumptuary decrees, but privately rewarded courtiers who broke them, so long as they did it in style. She herself owned hundreds of dresses in forbidden colours, and her court ladies competed to outshine her, sometimes literally. It was hypocrisy so blinding it could burn your eyes. Meanwhile, the common folk developed their own quiet rebellion. They mocked the absurdity of the laws in taverns and markets. Ballads circulated ridiculing nobles for caring more about sleeves than souls. A particularly biting satire from the late 1500s asked, "What sin hath linen wrought that it must serve the poor, whilst silk's for saints?" In a way, these jokes were early social commentary, Tudor humour as protest art. Eventually the laws faded from strict enforcement, buried under the weight of their own contradictions. But for decades they had succeeded in one crucial goal: making every Englishman acutely aware of his place in the grand human hierarchy of wardrobe. They turned clothing into a political act and disobedience into quiet revolution. The Tudors didn't just police morality, they policed hemlines. Every thread was a declaration of loyalty, every colour a confession of rank. In Tudor England, you didn't just wear your station, you were your station. So next time you grumble about a dress code, remember, at least no one's accusing your outfit of treason. If there's one thing Tudor nobles loved more than flaunting their power, it was buying proof of it from someone else's country. Nothing said English pride quite like bankrupting yourself for an Italian sleeve. The Tudor elite didn't just want to look rich, they wanted to look continental. Because let's face it, in the 1500s, England wasn't exactly setting global fashion trends. France had the flair, Italy had the artistry, and Flanders had the velvet. England had sheep, but sheep could only get you so far. The wealthy classes decided wool was for peasants and started importing foreign fabrics like there was no tomorrow. And for some of them, financially, there really was no tomorrow. The trade routes that connected Europe to the east, the famous Silk Road, may have been ancient, but under the Tudors, they became status superhighways for silk, lace and jewels. Suddenly, every noble with a coin to spare wanted a piece of that shimmering imported luxury. Let's start with Italian silk, the gold standard of Renaissance fashion. Smooth, luminous and utterly impractical, it was the Tudor equivalent of driving a sports car through a muddy village. Italy's weaving centres, Florence, Venice and Lucca, were the epicentres of elegance. English merchants risked storms, pirates and diplomatic headaches just to get their hands on a few bolts of it. When that silk finally reached London, it cost more per yard than most farmers earned in a year. And yet, nobles couldn't get enough. They wore it, lined their sleeves with it, even used it for curtains and bed hangings. Nothing said, "I have money to burn," quite like sleeping under something worth more than your tenant's cottage. Then there was Flemish velvet, the soft, deep-textured fabric that turned every Tudor noble into a human treasure chest. Woven in Bruges and Antwerp, velvet was notoriously hard to produce. It required a double loom, precision weaving, and months of labour. The result was fabric so rich and heavy it could double as body armour, which, considering the political climate, wasn't the worst idea. Nobles adored it because it caught the light like nothing else. The candlelit halls of Hampton Court glowed not just from wax, but from the reflection of 100 over-decorated nobles shimmering in imported cloth. And of course, no Tudor wardrobe was complete without French lace. France had mastered the art of delicate excess. Lace wasn't just fabric, it was embroidery that defied reason. The French called it dentelle, which literally means little teeth, an appropriate name considering it chewed through English wallets. A small collar of fine lace could cost as much as a carriage, but could the Tudors resist? Of course not. A Tudor noble without lace was like a knight without armour, scandalous, naked and unfit for polite company. What made this all worse was the psychology behind it. Tudor nobles weren't just buying fashion, they were buying legitimacy. To wear Italian silk was to suggest you were as cultured as a Medici, even if your family had been mud farmers a century earlier. Imported fabric wasn't just about beauty, it was about proximity to power. If Europe was the fashion capital of civilization, then dressing like Europe meant you belonged in the club. The problem, membership came with no discounts. Merchants, naturally, saw an opportunity. The merchant adventurers of London and Bristol became middlemen of vanity, building fortunes by catering to noble obsession. They travelled abroad, negotiated with Italian and Flemish traders, and came back with cargo holds full of dreams wrapped in satin. Many nobles didn't even have the ready cash to pay for it all, so they borrowed. Credit was extended, debts were made, and estates began quietly sliding into ruin. It was the 16th century version of buy now, cry later. The irony is that this foreign fabric craze directly contradicted the Tudor government's push for domestic pride. Henry VIII had spent years promoting English wool as the heart of the national economy. But his courtiers, desperate to impress him, ignored that entirely. While the king thundered about supporting English clothiers, his nobles were strutting around dressed like Florentine bankers. It was hypocrisy wrapped in velvet, and everyone knew it. The church wasn't amused either. Preachers condemned this obsession with imported extravagance as sinful vanity. Sermons warned that silk was the devil's fabric, designed to ensnare the proud and ruin the righteous. Did it stop anyone? Of course not. If anything, it made it trendier. Nothing tempts a Tudor quite like a moral prohibition. There were practical problems too. Imported fabrics didn't exactly thrive in England's famously damp climate. Silk stained, lace frayed, and velvet moulded faster than a week-old pudding. Maintaining these garments required entire staffs of cleaners and stitchers, more cost, more servants, more debt. But the nobles wore them anyway. If a French doublet fell apart in the rain, it was fine. You could always buy another one on credit. The royal tailors had to adapt as well. They mixed foreign fabrics with English dentines, creating bizarre hybrids, doublets that looked like armour from the waist up and curtains from the waist down. And because imported materials were so prized, they were recycled endlessly. A gown might be cut apart and refashioned half a dozen times, each iteration adding new embroidery or imported lace. A Tudor's outfit had more lives than a cat, and yet, for all their wasteful spending, these nobles weren't fools. They understood that appearances could open doors. A well-dressed courtier could win royal favour, land grants, or even marriages that paid off the debts their wardrobe had caused. Fashion was an investment, however terrible the interest rate, but many didn't survive the game. Accounts from the late 1500s describe noble families selling ancestral lands, cutting down their own forests, and pawning heirlooms, all to fund their next wardrobe shipment from Antwerp. By the time Elizabeth I reigned, entire estates had been hollowed out by a century of silk and lace mania. England's nobility looked magnificent, right up until the moment they couldn't afford their laundry bill. And yet, history is rarely kind to restraint. The ones who dressed simply are long forgotten. The ones who dressed outrageously are painted in oils and remembered forever. The imported luxury that bankrupted Tudor nobles also immortalised them. To this day their portraits hang in galleries, glittering with Italian silk, French lace and Flemish velvet, a permanent reminder that in Tudor England, looking rich was worth dying poor, because in the end nothing said English pride like bankrupting yourself for an Italian sleeve. Every Tudor noble dreamed of being noticed at court, but behind every shimmering sleeve and gold-threaded doublet stood a small army of unsung heroes and opportunists. The tailors, seamstresses, and embroiderers who stitched together the Tudor dream and their clients' financial downfall. These were not your average craftsmen. They were the power brokers of appearance, the stylists of status, the enablers of extravagance. They were the influencers of their day, except instead of hashtags, they used gold thread. In a world where appearance meant everything, these artisans quietly held the keys to social survival. The Tudor court might have been ruled by kings and queens, but fashion? That was ruled by the Guild of Tailors. Operating in every major city, London, York, Bristol, the guilds controlled the production, pricing, and training of anyone who dared to touch a noble's garments. They were part artisans, part gatekeepers, and part mafia. You didn't just decide to become a tailor. You served years as an apprentice, mastering the art of cutting cloth so precisely that a sleeve could make or break a career. The Tudor tailor wasn't just a needle jockey. He was a confidant, a strategist, a silent witness to the chaos of noble vanity. While the court discussed alliances and treaties, the tailors were busy managing the truly serious politics. Whether the Duke of Norfolk's new doublet outshone the Earl of Surrey's, their workshops buzzed with activity. Assistants ironing, apprentices fetching fabrics, journeymen measuring nobles who insisted their waists were 2 inches smaller than reality. In a society that prized image above all, the tailor was therapist, magician, and accomplice rolled into one. Then there were the embroiderers, whose work turned fabric into alchemy. Embroidery in Tudor England wasn't just decoration, it was power made visible. Every noble worth their salt had garments covered in patterns of pomegranates, roses, and Tudor knots, symbols of lineage, loyalty, and royal favour. The most skilled embroiderers were often women, working from home or small workshops in London and Westminster. These women spent endless hours hunched over frames, threading gold, silver and silk into complex designs that could take weeks or even months to complete. A single gown could contain thousands of individual stitches, each one a prayer for payment that might or might not come on time. It was meticulous, grueling, eye-straining work, but it paid well when the client was generous. Unfortunately, the generosity was rare. Tudor nobles were notorious for delayed payments. Tailors and embroiderers often waited months, even years, to be paid for their labour. It was common for a craftsman to petition the court, or the monarch himself, demanding overdue wages. One tailor famously wrote to Henry VIII, pleading for the money owed for the king's latest cloth of gold ensemble, warning that his family would perish for want of bread, while your grace sparkles in my unpaid stitches. It's unclear whether Henry paid up, but history strongly suggests he didn't. Despite the financial struggles, these artisans had incredible influence. They shaped how England looked. The designs that graced the backs of nobles became cultural statements. Through the tailor's hands, English fashion evolved from the stiff medieval silhouette into the elaborate, sculpted look we associate with the Tudor court. The padded shoulders, slashed sleeves and exaggerated skirts weren't accidents. They were innovations born in the tailor's workshop, often borrowed and reimagined from continental trends. Think of these artisans as early trendsetters. When a foreign ambassador arrived in a new style of Italian doublet, tailors studied it, dissected it, and reinterpreted it for English tastes within weeks. Nobles didn't invent fashion. They outsourced it to the craftsmen who could copy, adapt, and improve it faster than the next court banquet. If you wanted to keep up with the king's wardrobe, you didn't beg a favour, you bribed your tailor. And speaking of bribery, the Tudor tailoring industry was riddled with intrigue. Rival workshops spied on one another, stealing patterns or undercutting prices. Tailors who worked for royal favourites often received hush money to leak upcoming designs, or to not leak them, depending on how desperate their clients were for exclusivity. There was even a kind of sartorial espionage at play. Foreign ambassadors paid English tailors to learn what the court was planning to wear to major events. Because in Tudor politics, knowing whether the Queen planned to wear French lace or English wool could be as valuable as knowing who she planned to marry. The hierarchy within the industry itself was strict. The master tailor was the kingpin, overseeing clients and collecting payments, while journeymen cut patterns and apprentices handled menial labour like pressing and cleaning. Embroiderers worked in parallel, often subcontracted for specific pieces, collars, cuffs, or embroidered sleeves. Then came the goldsmiths, who provided metal thread and sequins, and the dyers, who ensured the colours were vivid enough to make peasants squint in awe. It was a fashion ecosystem, a network of specialists all feeding off noble vanity. Among the elite craftsmen were legends, people like John Skelton, tailor to the Duke of Suffolk, known for inventing the square-shouldered doublet that became a masculine power symbol, or Alice Montague, an embroiderer whose gold-threaded work was said to shimmer like dawn upon a field. These artisans might not have titles, but they had clout. When a noble's wardrobe made headlines or gossip lines, the credit often belonged to them. And let's not forget the seamstresses, the invisible labour force that did most of the actual sewing. These women were underpaid, overworked, and essential. They sat in cramped workshops, stitching into the night by candlelight while noble clients fretted about rough symmetry. Many seamstresses lived in poverty, despite producing garments worth more than their yearly rent. Some turned to selling ribbons or mending clothes for commoners on the side. Others, less fortunately, to pawning stolen scraps of silk just to survive. Yet even in this exploitative system, artisans found pride in their work. To produce a gown fit for court was to leave a mark on history, even if no one remembered your name. The Tudor court might have looked divine, but behind that glitter was human sweat, sore fingers, and unpaid invoices. Still, business was booming. As long as nobles kept chasing prestige, the fashion mafia thrived. Tailors became indispensable. embroiderers became artists, and the economy of ego kept spinning. In the end, the Tudor tailor wasn't merely sewing clothes, they were sewing class, politics, and ambition into every hemline. Because in Tudor England, power may have worn velvet, but it was stitched together by people with calloused hands and very patient creditors. If Instagram had existed in the 1500s, Henry VIII would have crashed it before noon. He didn't just wear clothes, he weaponized them. The man wasn't content to rule England. He needed to outshine it, one jewel-encrusted doublet at a time. For Henry, fashion wasn't personal style, it was a political statement, a flex of divine authority sewn in silk and stitched with ego. And oh, did he flex. Let's begin with the sheer scale of his wardrobe. Henry VIII owned over 8,000 garments in his lifetime, enough to clothe a small village, or at least several hundred nervous courtiers pretending they weren't wearing last season's velvet. His tailors' accounts read like fantasy shopping lists: cloth of gold, crimson satin, silver damask, fur-lined cloaks, feathered caps, jewelled girdles, and hose so tight they might qualify as armour. Henry didn't get dressed. He assembled himself, layer by glorious layer, until he resembled a walking tapestry. His doublets, those short-fitted jackets, were padded, puffed, and studded with precious stones. He loved broad shoulders and aggressive silhouettes that screamed, "I could conquer France and still make it back in time for dinner." The wider his shoulders looked, the more formidable his image. His wardrobe was designed not to flatter but to dominate, physically and symbolically. When Henry entered a room, he wasn't just seen. He happened to the room, and then there was his codpiece, that infamous centerpiece of Tudor male fashion. Originally it was a practical flap covering the gap between hose, but Henry turned it into something far more theatrical, a declaration of virility, potency, and maybe a small cry for help. The codpiece grew larger as his waistline did, becoming less an accessory and more a small architectural feature. Foreign ambassadors couldn't stop mentioning it in their letters. One Venetian envoy delicately wrote that the king adorns himself most magnificently, especially below the girdle. Translation: it's impossible to make eye contact. But Henry's love of grandeur wasn't mere vanity, it was strategy. He understood that appearance could unify a kingdom more effectively than decrees. When he came to power in 1509, England was still shaking off medieval austerity. His father, Henry VII, had been cautious, even miserly, a man who pinched pennies and favoured plain robes. Young Henry wanted none of that. He wanted to look like the Renaissance incarnate, the perfect fusion of chivalry, masculinity, and divine right. His body became propaganda, his clothing a national brand. Every detail was calculated. The gold chains draped across his chest symbolised not greed, but majesty. The elaborate embroidery on his sleeves wasn't mere decoration. It represented his dominion over the realm's finest craftsmen. The bright colours, often crimson or purple, shouted royal privilege. Henry's garments were custom-made to catch candlelight so that in every court procession, feast, or joust, he literally glowed. He was the human embodiment of "you can't sit with us." Even his fabrics told a story. Henry favoured materials from across Europe: Florentine velvets, Venetian silks, and Spanish brocades, to display England's reach and his own wealth. His tailors recorded entire ships arriving at Southampton stuffed with fabric for the royal wardrobe. He personally approved new designs and ordered custom patterns that featured Tudor symbols: roses, crowns, lions, all woven into the cloth itself. His body became a canvas for royal propaganda. The royal court quickly followed suit. If the king appeared in gold-threaded satin, no noble dared show up in plain wool. Henry's courtiers mirrored his style with such fervour that entire fortunes vanished in the pursuit of royal imitation. Even ambassadors adapted, arriving in dazzling finery to avoid being mistaken for peasants. Foreign visitors described the English court as a theatre of shimmering gold. In reality, it was an economy of debt held together by sequins and fear. Henry's obsession with an appearance extended beyond clothes. It shaped his entire public persona. He knew that in a pre-photography world, images mattered. Every royal portrait was stage-managed to perfection. In Hans Holbein's iconic depiction, Henry stands square-shouldered, legs apart, hands on hips, an image of absolute power. But the clothes do half the talking: jewelled sleeves, fur-trimmed robe, ornate chain, and yes, that codpiece taking up more visual real estate than his face. Holbein's portrait wasn't just art, it was royal advertising. England's monarch, larger than life and richer than everyone else combined. Ironically, as Henry aged and his body began to expand, his fashion only grew more aggressive. When waistlines rise, so do necklines. So he compensated with thicker fabrics, heavier jewels, and more ornate designs. Late in life, his clothes became armour against decline. Beneath the layers of gold and velvet was a man battling disease and decay. But to the world, he remained the invincible king. Even when ulcers ravaged his legs and movement became painful, he still demanded to be dressed in his finest. His courtiers sometimes needed ropes and pulleys to hoist his garments onto him, but by God he would shine. Behind the spectacle was genius. Henry understood the psychology of spectacle better than anyone before him. His fashion diplomacy dazzled allies and intimidated enemies. When French ambassadors visited, he met them dressed head to toe in cloth of gold, a deliberate move to humiliate the famously stylish French court. At tournaments, he appeared in glittering armour trimmed with rubies, turning combat into performance art. Every appearance reinforced his status not just as king, but as something more than human. His extravagance trickled down through the entire nation. London's tailors, embroiderers and jewellers thrived on royal commissions. The court set the tone for what was fashionable, and Henry's influence made England a burgeoning hub of Renaissance luxury. Of course, this also meant that countless nobles bankrupted themselves trying to keep up, but to Henry that was simply proof of loyalty. When he died in 1547, his wardrobe was legendary, an empire of fabric, jewels and fur that symbolised his reign as much as any castle or treaty. He left behind not just political chaos and religious upheaval, but an enduring image, a man whose clothes became his crown. Henry VIII didn't follow fashion trends. He created them, bulldozed them, and then made you pay for the privilege of copying them. In a kingdom obsessed with appearances, he understood the ultimate truth. People may forget your words, but they'll never forget your outfit. And in Henry's case, neither will history. Ah yes, the codpiece, that proud, puffed and utterly perplexing piece of Tudor engineering that managed to turn every man's lower half into a statement piece. If you've ever looked at a portrait of Henry VIII and thought, that can't possibly be necessary, you're right, it wasn't. But in Tudor England, logic took one look at fashion and fled the country. The codpiece began as a modest scrap of fabric and ended as the most ridiculous male fashion trend Europe had ever seen. Because nothing says power like a small pouch screaming midlife crisis. To understand how this scandalous fashion icon came to be, we must start with a wardrobe malfunction. In the late medieval period, men wore hose, tight-fitting leggings made of wool or silk. Originally, each leg was a separate piece tied to the doublet with laces. Functional, sure, but this left one awkward problem, a very conspicuous gap at the centre. For decades, men just wore long tunics over it and pretended it didn't exist. But as tunics got shorter during the early 1500s, the gap became difficult to ignore. Enter the codpiece, a triangular flap of cloth designed to cover the problem. Simple, right? A practical fix. Except this is Tudor England we're talking about, and nothing practical ever stayed that way for long. What began as modesty soon became masculinity merch. Within a decade, that humble flap grew, puffed, stuffed and armoured its way into legend. What started as protection for dignity turned into a declaration of dominance. The bigger the codpiece, the bigger the ego, and the poorer the judgment. By Henry VIII's reign, the codpiece had evolved into something almost architectural. Tailors padded it with wool, horsehair, or even bran to maintain its shape. Some were detachable, others hinged, a few gilded in gold cloth or embroidered with jewels. There are surviving examples so large they could store an apple, or more likely the owner's fragile sense of self. They were fastened with ribbons, buttons, or hidden hooks, allowing for convenience. Yes, they were functional. Let's just say the Tudor gentleman didn't have to fully undress to negotiate with nature. But why exactly did this piece of cloth take on such absurd importance? The answer lies in Renaissance culture's favourite subject, virility. The 16th century was obsessed with masculinity as proof of divine favour, political power and social dominance. The codpiece became the billboard for all of it. It told the world, I am strong, fertile and terrifyingly confident. Never mind that you probably owed half your estate to your tailor. It was all about projection. The Tudor court was a jungle, and the codpiece was plumage. Henry VIII naturally led the charge. As his body expanded and his health declined, his codpiece somehow kept growing. Portraits from the 1530s show it protruding so dramatically it could probably be used as a writing desk. Some historians even suggest Henry's codpiece may have been symbolic compensation for his failing fertility and waning virility. Others argue it was simply fashion gone mad. Either way, it became a royal trademark. Courtiers followed suit, terrified to be seen in anything smaller. Within a few years, England looked like it was being invaded by an army of proud padded peacocks. Of course, not everyone was impressed. Across Europe, the codpiece craze became the butt of endless jokes, pun very much intended. Italian courtiers mocked English heroes of the lower banner. French pamphlets referred to the trend as la folie anglaise, the English madness. Even the Spanish, hardly known for subtlety, found it excessive. One Spanish ambassador wrote home that the English nobles carry before them such monstrous appendages that they must walk like geese. Yet ridicule only made it more popular. The Tudors loved being noticed, even for bad reasons. The codpiece also found itself entangled in darker symbolism. As warfare and knightly imagery still dominated male ideals, the exaggerated pouch took on connotations of armour. Some were literally made of metal, worn beneath or over hose as protection. Because nothing says battlefield practicality like an iron jockstrap, it became a strange fusion of eroticism and chivalry, half weapon, half boast. Even the word cod came from Middle English for bag or scrotum. So yes, they knew exactly what they were doing. The obsession didn't stay confined to nobles. Wealthy merchants and upwardly mobile gentlemen eagerly joined the race, their tailors competing to create the most extravagant designs. Some codpieces were decorated with tassels, jewels, or even family crests. There are records of codpieces perfumed with musk to make their presence, shall we say, more memorable. Others contained small pockets for coins or love tokens. Essentially, the Tudor man turned his groin into a wallet with delusions of grandeur. But fashion, like fortune, is fickle. By the late 1500s, the codpiece began to fall out of favour. Elizabeth IV's reign ushered in a new aesthetic, more restrained, more refined, and far less interested in public displays of anatomy. The elaborate doublets remained, but the stuffing was gone. The focus shifted upwards to enormous ruffs and jewelled collars. Scholars think Elizabeth's court, dominated by female influence, found the codpiece, well, embarrassing. Nothing killed a trend faster than the Queen rolling her eyes at it. Still, the codpiece refused to disappear entirely. It lingered in military uniforms for decades, repurposed as practical armour padding, and occasionally resurfaced in theatrical costumes. But its golden age of absurdity ended with the Tudors, leaving behind centuries of jokes and one very confused generation of portrait viewers. Historians today see the codpiece as a fascinating insight into Renaissance psychology, a symbol of anxiety disguised as confidence. It represented the collision between changing gender ideals, rising nationalism, and the human tendency to compete in the most unnecessary ways imaginable. In other words, it was history's most expensive Freudian slip. Modern audiences might laugh, but the spirit of the codpiece lives on. Whether it's luxury watches, supercars, or designer logos the size of dinner plates, the instinct is timeless. The Tudor gentleman strutted his worth with fabric and padding. Today, we just call it branding. And so the codpiece stands as a monument to one of the strangest arms races in fashion history, a literal arms race, only pointed downward. It was the Renaissance equivalent of shouting, "Look at me," and then paying dearly for the attention. Because nothing says power like a small pouch screaming midlife crisis. Life at the Tudor court was a spectacle, but not the kind where you could just show up and hope for the best. No, attending court was like starring in an endless fashion pageant directed by a monarch who doubled as both judge and trend dictator. Here, your clothing wasn't just attire, it was performance art, politics, and personal survival stitched together with gold thread. The royal wardrobe didn't stop at fashion statement. It was an occupation. It wasn't a wardrobe, it was a full-time job. Let's begin with the basics. If you were a courtier, your entire day revolved around the monarch's changing wardrobe schedule. The king or queen didn't just dress in the morning and call it a day. There were stages: morning dress for receiving visitors, afternoon wear for hunting or meetings, evening garments for dining, and ceremonial costumes for banquets or religious observances. Each required new fabrics, accessories, and colours, many coordinated with the ruler's own attire. Imagine waking up at dawn bleary-eyed, only to realise you had 2 hours to transform into a living gemstone because the Queen was wearing crimson that day, and you better not clash. To wear the wrong shade in the wrong audience chamber could be catastrophic. Not fatal, perhaps, but in Tudor politics, social death was nearly as bad. This obsessive coordination wasn't merely about vanity, it was a visual code of loyalty. At Henry VIII's court, wearing the king's favoured colour signalled devotion. Under Elizabeth of Russos, it became a strategic art form. If she appeared in gold, courtiers scrambled to wear matching tones, hoping she might glance their way. The court looked less like a political body and more like an overfunded peacock colony. The sheer number of outfits required was mind-boggling. Nobles might bring dozens, sometimes hundreds of ensembles to court. Each outfit had to be meticulously planned and rotated so no one could accuse you of repetition. Repeating a gown too soon could mark you as unfashionable or worse, financially unstable. In a world where image equaled power, being seen twice in the same embroidered doublet was the Tudor version of declaring bankruptcy. Then came the rituals. Dressing itself was an event, especially for the monarch. The morning dressing ceremony, known as the levee, was as political as it was personal. Courtiers of high rank competed for the honour of helping the monarch get dressed. One might hold a sleeve, another the gloves, while someone else presented the jewellery. Being allowed to hand the king his shirt was like being promoted to the inner circle of influence. Henry VIII's grooms of the wardrobe knew that a well-timed compliment on a new doublet could secure favour faster than a decade of loyal service. Even for lesser nobles, dressing was a team sport. It took multiple attendants to lace, layer, and fasten the intricate garments of the time. The average nobleman wore a linen shirt, padded doublet, hose, cloak, and possibly armour, or, for formal occasions, layers of embroidered coats and furs. Women had it even harder. Corsets, farthingales, petticoats, gowns, and sleeves that needed to be tied or pinned into place. There's a reason Tudor portraits show everyone standing stiffly. It wasn't dignity, it was lack of oxygen. Court life offered no privacy, and clothing was a public performance. Every entrance, every stroll through the palace halls was an opportunity to be seen and judged. The Tudor court operated like a live-action social media feed, complete with its own influencers, trends, and brutal comment sections. Courtiers whispered critiques of each other's outfits. "Did you see Lady Stafford's gown? That shade of green is solus mucklemus." Even the act of changing clothes became political theatre. During the day, courtiers might retreat to their chambers for what was called disguising, essentially costume changes between events. Banquets required one look, dancing another, and private audiences yet another. There are reports of nobles changing outfits as many as 6 or 7 times a day. The servants, meanwhile, lived in constant panic, pressing, cleaning and maintaining fragile garments worth more than their yearly wages, and heaven help you if something went wrong. A loose thread, a stained cuff, or a crooked ruff could spell humiliation. Elizabethan courtiers were known to carry spare collars and cuffs in case of fashion emergencies, the Tudor equivalent of a portable charger. The starching of ruffs alone was an entire profession, requiring precision and time, and if your ruff drooped mid-ceremony, you might as well feign illness and flee. The wardrobe demands didn't stop at the human body. Horses, too, were fashion accessories. At grand processions, noble steeds wore embroidered trappings that matched their riders' outfits, complete with heraldic patterns and tassels. One ambassador complained that English pageants were so elaborate, even the horses are more finely dressed than many princes of Europe. For those lucky, or unlucky, enough to travel with the monarch on royal progress, the logistics became nightmare fuel. Entire wagons were dedicated solely to clothing. The Queen's travelling wardrobe required dozens of attendants, hundreds of garments, and careful management to prevent wrinkling, theft, or, worst of all, rain damage. The wardrobe clerks were the unsung heroes of the Tudor machine, managing inventories that would make modern stylists weep. But there was method to this madness. Every costume change, every coordinated colour scheme reinforced hierarchy and power. The court's glittering display wasn't just aesthetic, it was psychological warfare. The monarch's magnificence reminded everyone of their place in the divine order. A perfectly orchestrated court wasn't just beautiful, it was politically efficient. When everyone's focused on lace, no one questions taxes. Foreign visitors were awestruck, but French envoys described English court life as a theatre without end, where the nobles wear their estates on their sleeves. The Venetians noted that the English obsession with costume confounds the eyes, suggesting that the monarchy's wealth seemed limitless. And that was the point. The Tudors didn't just want to rule. They wanted to dazzle people into obedience. Of course, all that glitter came at a price. Behind the glamour lay exhaustion, debt, and paranoia. Courtiers routinely spent fortunes maintaining their wardrobes, often borrowing money from merchants to stay competitive. Servants worked through the night preparing outfits for the next day's spectacle. Fashion wasn't leisure. It was survival in silk form. By the end of the day, as the candles burned low and the court dispersed, nobles would collapse into bed still half-dressed, too weary to undo the endless knots, hooks, and laces. And when dawn came, they'd do it all over again, because in the Tudor world the performance never stopped. At court, you didn't just live under the monarch's gaze, you sparkled beneath it. Every moment was staged, every outfit a gamble. After all, in a world where your social worth could unravel as quickly as a loose thread, dressing wasn't fashion. It was strategy, diplomacy, and sheer endurance. It wasn't a wardrobe, it was a full-time job. If Henry VIII was the original fashion influencer, his daughter Elizabeth I was the entire Renaissance version of Vogue, GQ, and NASA combined. Her wardrobe wasn't just grand, it was gravitational. Elizabeth's outfits were so heavy she didn't walk, she slowly orbited. When she took the throne in 1558, England was still licking its wounds from the chaos of her father's marital rampages and her half-sister Mary's fiery reign. Elizabeth knew she had a credibility problem. She was a woman in a world of men, a Protestant in a country recently drenched in Catholic blood, and a monarch without an heir. So what did she do? She turned herself into an icon, literally. If Henry ruled by spectacle, Elizabeth ruled by illusion. Her clothes didn't just decorate her, they defined her. Elizabeth understood that fashion was theatre, and she played the leading role with terrifying precision. Every detail of her wardrobe was political strategy disguised as glitter. Her pale, powdered face, so white it could guide ships through fog, wasn't vanity, it was symbolism. In an era where women were considered fragile and impure, Elizabeth styled herself as the Virgin Queen, untouched, divine, and immortal. Her ghostly complexion wasn't an accident. It was a calculated glow-up designed to erase humanity and replace it with myth. To maintain this image, she wore white lead makeup mixed with vinegar and sometimes even mercury. It gave her a celestial glow under candlelight, but at a terrible cost. The toxic concoction corroded her skin over the years, forcing her to apply thicker and thicker layers. By her later reign, she had essentially spackled herself into legend. Beneath that mask of radiance, the woman was literally crumbling, but the icon remained flawless. And then there were the clothes. Elizabeth's gowns were feats of engineering, weighing up to 60 pounds and requiring several ladies-in-waiting to get her into them. They were structured masterpieces, stiffened bodices, enormous farthingales, those bell-shaped skirts that could double as siege engines, and ruffs so wide she could have used them as emergency flotation devices. Each outfit was a statement, an architectural manifesto of wealth, authority, and celestial superiority. When she entered a hall, courtiers didn't bow just because she was queen. They bowed because she was the most physically impressive object in the room. Her colour choices were equally deliberate. White symbolised purity, gold meant divinity, black evoked authority and mourning, often reminding courtiers of her eternal widowhood to the realm. Jewel tones, emerald, ruby, sapphire, signalled royal control over the very elements of nature. In paintings, she was often depicted wearing pearls, which symbolised chastity. She loved pearls so much that one ambassador claimed her collection could ransom a kingdom, and honestly, he wasn't exaggerating. But Elizabeth's wardrobe wasn't just about self-presentation, it was about domination. Her courtiers quickly learned that fashion at her court was a contact sport. To be seen in outdated attire was to invite ridicule. To wear something that accidentally clashed with the Queen's colour palette was social suicide. Every court event became an arms race of lace and jewels, with nobles spending entire fortunes just to keep up with her radiant majesty. One French observer wrote that Elizabeth's court looked like a living garden of silk and silver, where each noble seemed to bloom in artificial glory. Another foreign visitor complained that none in Christendom do so exceed in apparel, which is diplomatic code for these people have lost their minds. But Elizabeth wouldn't have it any other way. She encouraged the competition because it kept her nobles focused on fashion and distracted from politics. Elizabeth even regulated fashion the way her father had legislated morality. Through a series of proclamations, she dictated what her courtiers could and couldn't wear, ensuring that her own wardrobe always outshone theirs. The sumptuary laws under her reign became more about personal branding than class control. Only certain nobles could wear specific fabrics or trims, but the Queen herself? She was above all law. If Henry VIII used clothing to project virility, Elizabeth used it to project immortality. Her wardrobe became a kind of royal propaganda machine. Courtiers commissioned portraits of her wearing the latest styles, then raced to imitate her look. One famous gown, described in court inventories, was made entirely of cloth of silver, embroidered with pearls and lined with ermine. Another was made of crimson velvet, encrusted with rubies, and so stiffened with whalebone that sitting was theoretically possible but practically suicidal. These were not clothes designed for comfort. They were armour, silken, glittering, unrelenting armour. Of course, keeping up with Elizabeth was ruinous. Nobles mortgaged estates and borrowed from merchants to stay fashionable. Tailors worked through the night to copy her ever-evolving wardrobe, and since Elizabeth often gifted her old gowns to favoured courtiers, after, of course, removing all the valuable jewels, receiving one was both an honour and a financial curse. The message was clear. If the Queen could appear divine, her subjects had better appear worthy of worshipping her. The court's obsession with outward perfection mirrored Elizabeth's own control over her image. She banned unflattering portraits and destroyed those that didn't meet her standards. The official Mask of Youth portrait template, used for decades, depicted her with flawless skin, endless poise, and a waist that would make a corset cry. In reality, she was aging, losing teeth, and increasingly frail. But the myth persisted. The Queen was eternal, unchanging, a Renaissance Photoshop project executed entirely in oil paint. Even foreign powers were dazzled. Spanish ambassadors, who once mocked her father's excess, described her court as a galaxy of gold. Diplomats who entered her presence often left breathless, partially from awe and partially from lack of airflow in her crowded, perfumed chambers. One Venetian envoy confessed, "Her Majesty doth shine as the sun, before whom all lesser lights are put out." Translation: everyone else looked like peasants standing near a chandelier. Her image became her greatest weapon. While kings across Europe relied on armies, Elizabeth conquered with style. Her dazzling appearances at courtly events like the annual Accession Day tilts were acts of pure political theatre. The crowd didn't just see a queen, they saw the living embodiment of England's strength, prosperity and divine favour. By the end of her reign, the Elizabethan look had exploded into Europe's most recognisable aesthetic. The high ruff, the jewelled bodice, the pale complexion, the impossible grandeur. It became the dress code of ambition itself. But beneath all the lace and lead, the message remained clear. Fashion wasn't frivolity, it was power, stitched and starched into permanence. Elizabeth didn't walk through her court. She glided, shimmering and untouchable, her every movement an act of choreography. Behind her trailed the scent of perfume, pearls and bankruptcy, and as the courtiers bowed and strained under the weight of their own imitation finery, they knew one thing for certain. In this celestial court, there was only one true star. She didn't just rule England, she wore it. If there was one item of clothing that perfectly captured Elizabethan England's obsession with status, discomfort, and the limits of human neck mobility, it was the ruff, the glorious, absurd, gravity-defying halo of linen that turned every Tudor noble into a walking pastry. The ruff began as a small frill at the collar and evolved into a full-blown competitive sport. The rules were simple: make it whiter, make it wider, and make sure no one within a 10-foot radius forgets you're rich. Some ruffs were so wide you needed navigation lights. In the early 1500s, collars were modest. A bit of lace here, a delicate fold there. But then someone had the bright idea to starch them. Starch changed everything. With it, linen could hold its shape like armour, allowing collars to expand outward in dramatic architectural layers. What began as a polite frill became a personal satellite dish. By Elizabeth's reign, the ruff had grown so enormous that turning your head became a life choice. At court, ruffs were more than fashion. They were declarations of wealth and precision. Each fold was a measure of one's social worth. Nobles counted their pleats the way generals counted victories. There were figure-eight ruffs, cartwheel ruffs, and standing ruffs that looked like decorative guillotines. The fashion press didn't exist yet, but if it had, it would have been filled with headlines like "Duchess seen in hundredfold ruff, society in awe." Producing one was a miracle of geometry and masochism. A single ruff could require up to 18 yards of fine linen, gathered, stitched and pleated into meticulous folds. Each fold had to be shaped by heated irons, known as poking sticks, thin metal rods inserted into the fabric to sculpt the perfect wave. These irons were so dangerous that one London court case records a lady's servant accidentally setting her ruff on fire. Fashion victim, quite literally. But the true hero, or villain, of the ruff craze was starch. Invented in the Netherlands, starch turned soft linen into architectural sculpture. Elizabethan England became addicted. Starch houses popped up all over London, run mostly by Dutch immigrants who knew the secret recipe. The starching process was so état into high society that a new profession was born, the ruff starcher. These artisans were part chemist, part magician, part therapist to anxious nobles worried their collars weren't stiff enough. And yes, even starch had fashion trends. White was the standard, but soon daring courtiers began experimenting with colour. The boldest of them used yellow starch, inspired by a notorious woman named Mistress Dingen van der Plasse, the Dutch starch pioneer who brought the practice to England. For a time, her yellow ruff became the scandalous symbol of flamboyance. Preachers condemned it from pulpits as the colour of damnation, but that only made it more popular. The yellow ruff became the Elizabethan version of a designer label. Expensive, flashy, and slightly immoral. Of course, all this came at a price, both financial and physical. A single high-quality ruff could cost more than a year's rent for an ordinary citizen. Maintaining it required constant cleaning, starching, and reshaping. Servants had to carry portable cases to protect their masters' ruffs when travelling. And because the collars were detachable, nobles kept entire chests filled with them. Changing their ruff daily the way we might change a shirt. Owning one ruff meant you had taste. Owning 10 meant you had money. Owning 20 meant you were probably in debt and didn't care. Wearing them was an entirely separate challenge. Large ruffs extended outward as much as a foot from the neck, forcing the wearer to eat, drink and move with the care of a bomb technician. Dining with one was a nightmare. Forks barely existed, and spoons had to be navigated like weapons of diplomacy. Some nobles developed special ruff bibs to protect against soup spills, a clear sign that humanity had lost control of its priorities. And the medical community noticed. Physicians began warning of the ruff sickness, a condition supposedly caused by the neck strain and restricted breathing. Chronic dizziness, shoulder pain, and occasional fainting were all reported symptoms. It's safe to assume most doctors diagnosed the illness by asking, "How many folds did you say your ruff has?" Naturally, the men weren't immune. If anything, they were worse. Elizabethan men, ever desperate to appear virile and distinguished, took to wearing ruffs almost as large as the women's. Military portraits from the era show rugged knights in shining armour topped with collars that look like pastry rings. It's hard to take a war hero seriously when he looks ready to be served with icing sugar. As the ruff wars intensified, England's starch industry boomed. Imported linen from Flanders fed an endless cycle of folding, pressing and bragging. The wealthiest nobles hired exclusive starchers known only to their households, much like modern celebrities have as personal stylists. One ambassador visiting the English court described it perfectly. They carry about their necks the fortunes of a merchant. But beneath the pomp was panic. As with every Tudor fashion craze, keeping up was financially ruinous. The competition to have the largest, whitest and stiffest ruff sent courtiers spiralling into debt. Some nobles sold silverware or pawned jewels to fund their starch habits. Others tried to economise by using cheaper materials, which predictably ended in disaster. A poorly starched ruff could collapse mid-banquet, a fashion tragedy that could end a social career. The clergy, of course, despised the entire business. Sermons railed against the monstrous neck tires that symbolise pride and vanity. One furious preacher accused ruff wearers of trying to outface God himself. Another claimed that women's ruffs were so wide they blocked pew aisles and prevented people from hearing the gospel. Still, the trend persisted. God could wait. The starching appointment could not. Eventually, by the early 1600s, fashion exhaustion set in. The ruff began to shrink, replaced by more relaxed lace collars and bands. The age of the starched halo was over. England's nobles collectively exhaled, finally able to turn their heads again without risking whiplash. But the ruff left its mark on history. It defined an age of showmanship, vanity and ambition, an age where even one's throat became a canvas for wealth. It was the perfect symbol of Elizabethan excess, beautiful, impractical and impossible to ignore. So next time you complain about an uncomfortable tie, spare a thought for the Tudor noble whose collar required an afternoon of scaffolding and chemical engineering. The Elizabethans may have reached remarkable heights in poetry, exploration and politics, but nothing stood taller than their neckwear. And as the courtiers glided stiffly through the candlelit halls, unable to eat, breathe or look down, they knew one thing for certain. In the battle for elegance, circulation was optional. Some ruffs were so wide you needed navigation lights. If there's one thing the Tudors taught the world, it's that being fashionable sometimes requires sacrificing, well, your vital organs. The Elizabethan obsession with beauty and colour was so intense that it birthed an industry of lethal luxury. Dyes that could melt your skin, perfumes that could ignite, and makeup that would slowly dissolve your face into a Renaissance cautionary tale. It wasn't just vanity, it was chemical warfare in a corset, fashion so killer it actually killed people. Let's start with colour, the true currency of status. In the Tudor imagination, colour wasn't just pretty, it was weird. The right hue could elevate you, while the wrong one could ruin you. Nobles sought shades so vivid they looked supernatural, deep crimsons, royal purples and velvety blacks that seemed to drink in light. Unfortunately, nature hadn't invented enough safe pigments to satisfy human vanity. So Tudor chemists did what humans always do. They made their own and hoped no one died too quickly. The most coveted of all was Tyrian purple, a dye once made from the glands of Mediterranean sea snails. It took thousands of mollusks to produce even a small vial. England couldn't import enough of it, so local dyers turned to alternatives, like cudbear, a lichen dye, madder root, or, in some disastrous cases, lead oxide mixed with wine vinegar. That's right, nobles were literally coating themselves in poison just to look royal. You'd think someone would have noticed the irony of using lead white on one's face, and then wondering why everyone's teeth kept falling out. Speaking of faces, let's talk makeup. The Tudors took the concept of beauty as pain and upgraded it to beauty as prolonged suffering followed by organ failure. The Elizabethan beauty ideal was pale, smooth and unblemished, an aesthetic best described as corpse chic. To achieve this, women, and some daring men, used a concoction called Venetian ceruse, a foundation made from white lead and vinegar. It gave the skin a brilliant porcelain glow under candlelight, but it also absorbed directly into the bloodstream. Long-term use caused hair loss, tooth decay and skin necrosis. In short, you got to look flawless, until your face started falling off. Queen Elizabeth herself was famously devoted to the stuff. After a bout of smallpox in her 30s left her with scars, she began layering on thicker and thicker coats of ceruse to maintain her divine image. By her later years, her face was less complexion and more painted wall. Servants reportedly used breadcrumbs to gently remove the makeup at night, as if stripping plaster from a fresco. The next morning she'd apply a fresh layer and go back to dazzling ambassadors while quietly poisoning herself. But the nightmare didn't stop at foundation. Blushes were made from mercury sulfide known as vermilion, eyeshadow contained antimony, and lip colour was brewed from cochineal insects crushed into paste. In short, Tudor beauty was equal parts artistry and alchemy. Applying your morning routine required a mirror, a steady hand, and a complete disregard for self-preservation. Perfume, too, was less about smelling good, and more about surviving the 16th century's hygiene crisis. The Tudor world didn't believe in daily bathing, water was considered risky, and soap was suspiciously French. So the solution was masking, not cleaning. Enter the perfume craze. Nobles drenched themselves in scents made from musk, ambergris, rose, and civet, a secretion from a small cat-like creature which was every bit as glamorous as it sounds. These perfumes were alcohol-based, potent, and often flammable. One unfortunate duchess reportedly singed her eyebrows leaning too close to a candle. Perfumed gloves became all the rage, soaked in oils of orange blossom, jasmine, and clove. A good pair could make you smell like divine royalty. A bad batch could cause headaches, nausea, or fainting fits. People even perfumed their wigs and clothing. Elizabeth I had her ruffs lightly scented to disguise the musty odour of starched linen and lingering candle smoke. The court was a cloud of scent so thick you could probably navigate Whitehall by nose alone. Meanwhile, the world of dyeing fabrics was equally hazardous. Artisans worked with substances so toxic that few lived long enough to retire. To make that glorious Tudor black so deep and expensive it rivaled gold, dyers mixed iron oxide and oak galls in vats of acidic liquid. Handling the mixture without gloves caused burns and permanent staining. To achieve the richest reds, they used mercury and alum. For yellow, arsenic. For green, copper, compounds that were both stunning and spectacularly deadly. Every colour was a potential obituary. The irony: nobles paid enormous sums for these colours, while the poor dye workers, surrounded by fumes and chemicals, died young and unacknowledged. Their sacrifices literally coloured history. Quite literally, the working class dying so the upper class could shine. Even accessories weren't safe. Hair dye was another toxic thrill. Women bleached their hair with a mix of lye and urine to achieve that prized strawberry blonde shade, leaving them with a look somewhere between angelic and radioactive. Some used sulphur to lighten their locks, often burning the scalp in the process. The resulting colour was called Venetian blonde, which sounds glamorous until you realise it smelled like a rotten alchemy experiment. And yet, despite the danger, the demand for beauty never waned. Elizabeth's flawless image inspired an entire national aesthetic of polished perfection. Portraits from her court show ladies in waiting with alabaster skin, jewel-toned gowns, and hair stiffened into golden halos, every one of them an unpaid intern in the Queen's brand campaign. The look was deadly, but so was being unfashionable. Foreign visitors couldn't help but marvel. One Italian observer wrote, "The ladies of England are angels at a distance, but one fears to approach too near." Fair assessment, considering most of them were leaking lead. By the turn of the 17th century, the medical community finally began whispering that maybe, just maybe, coating one's epidermis in poison wasn't ideal, but the cult of appearance was too strong. For every woman who stopped using ceruse, 2 others doubled down, convinced that beauty was worth the cost. And so the Elizabethan age became the most glamorous toxic spill in history, a glittering dance between elegance and oblivion. In the pursuit of eternal youth, nobles turned themselves into living chemistry experiments. They sparkled, they shone, they died slightly faster. Because in this world of high fashion and higher mortality, one thing was certain. To look like a goddess, you had to risk dying like one. Fashion so killer, it actually killed people. If there's one thing Tudor women knew, it was that fashion wasn't just about beauty, it was about structural integrity. The gowns of the Elizabethan age were less clothing and more load-bearing architecture. Each dress was a masterpiece of engineering, requiring scaffolding, manpower, and occasionally divine intervention just to get into. It's said that a noblewoman's outfit took hours to assemble, and when she was finally finished, she wasn't so much wearing her gown as inhabiting it. You didn't sit, you docked. To begin constructing a proper Tudor gown, one started with the smock, a simple linen undergarment that was the only layer remotely breathable. Everything that came afterward was a test of endurance. Over the smock went the stays, or corset, made from layers of linen stiffened with reeds, whalebone, or even iron. Its purpose? To mould the torso into an immovable cone, flattening the bust, elongating the waist, and ensuring that breathing was purely optional. Tudor beauty was measured in inches, and the fewer you could inhale, the more fashionable you were. Next came the farthingale, the crown jewel of Renaissance over-engineering. Imported from Spain in the late 1500s, this wide-hooped skirt structure transformed the female silhouette into the shape of an inverted bell, or, depending on your mood, a ship ready for launch. Made of whalebone, wood, or even metal, it held the gown's massive skirts in perfect circular formation. A noble woman wearing one could easily take up an entire hallway by herself. Passing through a doorway required careful angling, and heaven help anyone seated beside her at dinner, you'd better enjoy leaning. The farthingale's physics were astonishing. It could reach over 5 feet in diameter, forcing women to walk with slow, gliding precision, like celestial bodies in orbit. Sitting required strategic planning and possibly an assistant for coordination. There are accounts of women backing into chairs with the delicacy of docking a galleon. Some even used footstools as mini-stages to avoid collapsing under their own fabric. Over the farthingale came petticoats, sometimes several, followed by layers of skirt fabric made from the finest materials available: brocade, damask, velvet and silk. The weight of all this could exceed 40 pounds, not including the jewellery or embroidery. The outer skirt, called the kirtle, was often opened at the front to reveal the ornate underskirt beneath. The result was a two-tone display of wealth that practically screamed, "I have enough fabric to clothe an army, but I'd rather wear it all myself." The bodice was equally complex. Enter the stomacher, a triangular panel inserted into the front of the bodice to create that smooth, rigid look. It was often embroidered with pearls, jewels, or gold thread, turning the chest into a work of art and occasionally a small treasury. Lacing or hooks attached it tightly to the gown, compressing everything beneath it into decorative submission. Putting one on without assistance was nearly impossible. You needed at least one maid, a prayer, and possibly a small crowbar. Sleeves were detachable, a blessing and a curse. They were tied, pinned, or sewn directly to the gown and could be swapped to match different outfits. The most fashionable were stuffed, puffed, and slashed to reveal contrasting fabrics underneath. They also doubled as subtle weapons. Those jewelled cuffs could easily bruise anyone who stood too close. And then came the finishing touches. Elaborate collars, dangling chains, jewelled belts, and sleeves embroidered within an inch of their lives. The more impractical it was, the higher the status it conveyed. After all, a woman who could barely move was clearly not someone who worked for a living. The Tudor elite wore their immobility like a badge of honour. Servants were indispensable in maintaining these gowns. Dressing a noblewoman was a military operation, often involving 3 or 4 attendants working in coordination. One laced, another buttoned, a third adjusted the farthingale's hoops to proper symmetry. Once assembled, their mistress resembled a human sculpture, stunning, motionless, and silently regretting every life choice that led to this moment. But fashion wasn't just for show, it was social communication. Every colour, fabric, and trim carried meaning. Deep crimson indicated wealth and royal favour. Black, so costly to dye, was the ultimate power move. Embroidery told stories, Tudor roses, vines, birds, and mythological creatures. A gown wasn't just clothing, it was a resume. You could literally read someone's status from the fabric. The discomfort, though, was legendary. Women fainted regularly during court events, not always from shock or scandal, but simply because their corsets didn't allow proper oxygen intake. Physicians of the time even warned against the constraining of the midriff in women of tender lungs, which is a poetic way of saying, "You're suffocating in that thing." Yet the fashion endured because fainting elegantly in public was still more acceptable than appearing out of style. Movement was an art form. Women learned to glide rather than walk, pivoting gracefully so their farthingales swayed like controlled pendulums. They couldn't run, bend, or, according to some reports, turn sideways without risking catastrophe. Dancing was another challenge entirely. During court masques, noblewomen rehearsed for hours to ensure their skirts didn't swing too widely and decapitate a nearby earl. Of course, the real spectacle came during travel. Imagine trying to climb into a carriage wearing 5 feet of reinforced linen and 40 pounds of velvet. Most women had to be lifted, yes, lifted, into vehicles or carried downstairs by servants. The farthingale's hoops could collapse under pressure, so special furniture and even custom chairs were designed to accommodate them. You didn't sit down in Tudor England, you made an appointment with gravity. Despite the absurdity, these gowns achieved exactly what they were meant to. Awe. They turned women into living monuments of wealth and grace, imposing, dazzling, untouchable. Elizabeth I herself used this silhouette to full effect. Her gowns expanded like solar flares, dominating every room she entered. Her courtiers imitated her, chasing her grandeur until they were buried in fabric and debt. It's easy to laugh at it now, but in an era where a woman's worth was tied to appearance, clothing was her armour. Beneath the farthingale and stomacher, the Tudor lady wasn't fragile, she was fortified. She couldn't move easily, but then she didn't have to. The world moved around her. So the next time you think your modern outfit feels restrictive, remember the Elizabethan lady, corseted, starched wool, hooped, jewelled, and possibly emitting the faint scent of scorched starch. Her gown wasn't just fashion, it was physics, politics, and masochism all at once. You didn't sit, you docked. If Elizabethan women were encased in fabric fortresses, the men were marching around in portable bakeries. The male wardrobe of Tudor England was a spectacular experiment in vanity, volume, and ventilation, best described as combat chic meets puff pastry. The famous slash and puff fashion turned the male body into a walking display of textile excess. Every nobleman looked like pastry dough that had gone to war. The doublet was the foundation of it all, the beating, padded heart of the Tudor male wardrobe. Originally a simple, close-fitting jacket worn under armour, it evolved into a garment of pure swagger. The doublet hugged the torso, puffed the chest, and cinched the waist so aggressively that men strutted like pigeons in a mating ritual. Tailors stiffened the front with bombast, a type of padding made from cotton, wool or rags, to exaggerate a manly V-shape. The result was part night, part overstuffed cushion. But the Tudors weren't content with structure alone. They wanted drama. They wanted art. And nothing said, "Look at me," quite like a doublet riddled with deliberate holes. Thus was born the slash and puff trend. Tailors cut dozens, sometimes hundreds of slits into the outer fabric of garments, then pulled colourful silk or velvet lining through the openings to create a textured, layered look. The effect was theatrical, bold, and completely impractical, everything a Tudor noble adored. The origins of this bizarre trend came from a rather unglamorous source: soldiers. During the late 1400s, Swiss mercenaries, after plundering battlefield supplies, began patching their clothes with pieces of captured enemy uniforms. The resulting ragged, multicoloured appearance, part fashion, part necessity, caught on with the nobility who decided it looked delightfully rebellious. What started as the clothing of battle-weary soldiers became, in classic aristocratic fashion, a luxury statement requiring 12 servants and a year's wages to achieve. By the height of Tudor fashion, the slash and puff had reached ludicrous proportions. Doublets, sleeves, hose, even shoes were carved up with knife-like precision. Some garments boasted slashes so intricate they resembled lacework. Courtiers competed over the artistry of their cuts, with one Spanish ambassador snidely remarking that English nobles slice their garments as though to show they bleed silk. Colour was everything. Beneath the slashed outer layer, vivid linings peeked out in shades of crimson, sapphire or emerald, each hue screaming, "I have more money than sense." The fabrics were often imported from Italy or Flanders, and the most fashionable men spent fortunes to ensure their linings shimmered under candlelight. There were even manuals advising on the optimal number of slashes for different social ranks. Apparently, if you were a duke, restraint was for peasants. But style wasn't limited to slashing. Padding became a full-blown national obsession. The Elizabethan man padded his chest, his shoulders, his thighs, even his calves. The goal was to look simultaneously broad, strong, and expensively ridiculous. The doublet's front was often quilted and stuffed to give the impression of a heroic torso, while the sleeves ballooned outward like inflated sausages. Courtiers resembled Renaissance action figures, immovable but impressively detailed. The padding arms race didn't stop there. Men began wearing peace god bellies, doublets stuffed to exaggerate a protruding stomach. The name came from the resemblance to a ripe pea pod, and it was meant to symbolize wealth and masculinity. After all, only a prosperous man could afford to look permanently full. Some courtiers even had their doublets padded asymmetrically, so the belly jutted forward like a cannon. Combined with their enormous sleeves and decorative hose, the effect was, let's be honest, less mighty warrior and more well-fed turkey. And speaking of hose, those skin-tight leggings were the finishing touch on the Tudor male silhouette. Worn in matching or contrasting colours, they were attached to the doublet with points, ribbons or laces threaded through metal eyelets. The fit was snug, and the fabric stretched over the legs like painted silk. Men proudly displayed their calves, which were considered the Elizabethan equivalent of abs. Portraits from the era show noblemen posing with one foot forward, leg flexed, as if auditioning for a very fancy Renaissance gym commercial. Shoes were equally flamboyant, square-toed and often slashed to reveal silk linings. Even gloves were decorated with embroidery and jewelled cuffs, because nothing says wealth like being unable to pick anything up without scratching it. To top it all off, a feathered cap and jewel-encrusted chain completed the ensemble. The Tudor gentleman didn't just dress, he declared war on subtlety. Naturally, all this grandeur required maintenance. Tailors, laundresses and starchers toiled endlessly to keep the fabrics in shape. Silk linings frayed, padding sagged, and slashes tore open, sometimes in public. The court of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I was filled with wardrobe malfunctions that would make modern red carpets blush. Nobles even carried portable sewing kits, because when your sleeves resemble baked soufflés, collapse is inevitable. Critics of the time were horrified. Puritan preachers denounced men's slashed garments as monuments of pride and folly, warning that vanity was leading England straight to hell, one puffed sleeve at a time, but moral outrage only fueled the trend. To the Tudors, excess was proof of success. If God didn't want you to flaunt your wealth, he wouldn't have invented velvet. Still, even the most fashionable man suffered for his splendour. The layered doublets were suffocating in summer and practically armour in winter. Movement was restricted, and padded shoulders made it impossible to scratch your own back. There are recorded cases of courtiers fainting during feasts because the heat trapped under their garments was unbearable. Yet no one dared complain. Fainting gracefully in gold brocade was still preferable to being seen in linen, like some common merchant. The look eventually softened toward the end of Elizabeth's reign, with slimmer doublets and less dramatic slashing. But for decades, Englishmen strutted through palaces and ballrooms like elaborately frosted pastries, puffed, slashed and stitched into magnificence. In a world obsessed with appearances, the doublet was the Tudor male's declaration of existence. I am here, I am rich, and I am possibly combustible. It was the fashion of bravado, armour made of ego, silk, and very poor decisions. They looked like pastry dough that had gone to war. In Tudor England, if you thought you could buy respect by simply wearing fine clothes, think again. True power didn't just hang from your shoulders, it glittered from your fingertips, jingled at your ankles and wafted through the air when you walked by. The Tudors had taken accessorizing to an Olympic level of excess. Every noble knew that wealth wasn't truly visible until it sparkled, clinked, or smelled expensive. Tudor nobles basically invented luxury branding. Let's start with shoes, those humble symbols of both vanity and foot pain. In an age when most peasants trudged barefoot or in crude leather boots, noble footwear was a proclamation of superiority. The wealthy didn't walk, they announced their arrival. Early in the 1500s, square-toed shoes were the rage, so wide and flat they looked like someone had ironed a loaf of bread. Henry VIII adored this style, which was convenient because it perfectly matched the size of his ego and his feet. He even decreed that no one could wear shoes with toes broader than 6 inches, a law that says more about royal insecurity than national necessity. But as the century progressed, shoe fashion evolved from broad and boxy to narrow and pointed, with embroidered uppers, slashed silk linings, and decorative rosettes. The finest pairs were made from velvet or soft kid leather, dyed crimson or gold and fastened with silver clasps. Some nobles even commissioned shoes studded with pearls or gemstones, because if your foot didn't resemble a small treasure chest, what were you even doing with your life? Shoes also carried meaning far beyond comfort. A knight's spurs, for instance, were symbols of chivalry and prestige. Only the upper classes were permitted to wear golden ones, while lesser men made do with brass. The sound of those spurs clinking down a palace corridor wasn't just noise, it was the Tudor equivalent of a verified badge. It said, I have rank, authority, and the balance of a man who never works. Then there were gloves, the ultimate status symbol of Tudor finesse. They weren't just to keep your hands warm, they were to show everyone else that you had hands worth protecting. Gloves were an extension of your personality, your scent, and occasionally your social reach. Elizabeth referred to herself adored gloves so much that she made them a diplomatic weapon. Visiting ambassadors were presented with pairs lined in silk and perfumed with exotic oils, each one a delicate power move disguised as courtesy. Perfumed gloves became an industry of their own. Imported from Spain and Italy, they were soaked in mixtures of rosewater, ambergris, musk, and even civet, charmingly unpleasant-smelling secretion from a small animal. The goal wasn't subtlety, it was to leave a lingering trail of fragrance long after you'd left the room. One chronicler remarked that entering the royal court was like stepping into a garden that had fainted from delight. Of course, not all gloves were created equal. The best were made of supple kid leather, imported from Cordoba, and could cost more than a servant's annual wage. And they weren't just worn, they were performed. A noble might dramatically remove a glove to emphasise a point in conversation, or drop it on the floor to issue a duel challenge. Throwing down the gauntlet wasn't metaphorical. It was fashion-fueled aggression. Gloves also became romantic tokens, exchanged between lovers. Receiving someone's glove was the Tudor equivalent of a text that read, "Thinking of you, covered in luxury and mild toxicity." If gloves expressed grace, belts and girdles screamed wealth. These weren't the simple leather straps of peasantry, but ornate accessories made from silk, silver or gold. They dangled with chains, pouches and miniature charms, like wearable jewellery that doubled as storage. Women hung tiny pomanders, scented orbs filled with herbs or perfume from theirs, believing the aroma would ward off disease. Men used their belts to carry daggers, purses, and sometimes small books of psalms, because nothing says I'm devout like accessorizing your religion in solid gold. And speaking of pomanders, these fragrant spheres deserve their own round of applause. Some were simple silver orbs. Others were masterpieces of filigree work that opened to reveal compartments of spices, amber, and dried rose petals. Their function was both practical and psychological. In a world where the smell of unwashed humanity lingered year-round, wearing a portable scent grenade was an act of both survival and superiority. The hat, yes, even the hat, became an accessory arms race. A nobleman's hat wasn't just an article of clothing, it was his calling card. Feathers were mandatory, preferably from exotic birds, and jewelled hat pins became small fortunes in themselves. Elizabethan courtiers competed for the tallest plumes, the rarest gems, and the most elaborate designs. Queen Elizabeth herself famously wore a hat adorned with an entire miniature crown, because of course she did. Every accessory was a coded message. To wear perfumed gloves was to say you moved in refined circles. To sport golden spurs was to declare your noble birth. To flaunt a jewelled dagger hilt was to whisper, "Yes, I might stab you, but elegantly." Even handkerchiefs, embroidered with lace and initials, became objects of flirtation and fashion politics. Dropping one in front of the right person could spark an entire courtly romance, or a duel, depending on who picked it up first. The accessory economy was enormous. Artisans, goldsmiths, glove makers and perfumers all thrived under the Tudor appetite for display. London's Cheapside market was filled with merchants hawking imported luxuries to nobles eager to outshine each other. An ambitious courtier might spend a fortune on accessories alone, often more than on their actual clothing. Tailors made the outfit. Goldsmiths made it unforgettable. But, as with all things Tudor, excess came at a cost. The demand for imported materials strained England's economy, driving nobles into debt and artisans into exhaustion. Apprentices inhaled poisonous dyes, perfumers handled flammable oils, and glove-makers tanned leather with arsenic-laced solutions. The cost of elegance wasn't measured in coin, it was measured in coughs. Still, the allure of accessories endured. They were the finishing touches that transformed a noble from wealthy landowner to living artwork. The Tudors didn't just dress, they curated themselves. Every buckle, ring and feather was a line in the poem of their self-importance. In the end, Tudor fashion was less about clothing and more about communication. A shoe said wealth, a glove said power, a jewel said, "I am dangerous and financially irresponsible." The accessories didn't just complete the outfit, they completed the illusion. Tudor nobles basically invented luxury branding. They didn't need logos, the glitter spoke for itself. If Tudor fashion was a theatre, jewellery was the stage lighting, blinding, dazzling, and impossible to ignore. Every noble worth their coat of arms sparkled like a chandelier on legs. Diamonds, pearls, sapphires, rubies. If it glittered, it was glued, stitched, or dangled somewhere on the body. Subtlety wasn't a Tudor virtue. The motto of the day might as well have been, "If it shined, it was mine." A Tudor noble didn't save for retirement, he wore it around his neck. The Tudor world loved jewellery, not merely as ornamentation, but as declaration. Gemstones weren't just pretty, they spoke. Each one carried meaning, superstition, and sometimes a faint hint of delusion. Rubies symbolised courage and divine favour. Sapphires stood for wisdom and chastity, though the latter was a relative term at Henry VIII's court. Emeralds represented fertility and renewal, which made them both fashionable and ironic in a monarchy where childbirth was national policy. Diamonds signified purity and strength, though in truth they mostly signified that you'd recently made an obscene amount of money from imported sugar or wool. Then there were pearls, the undisputed darlings of Elizabethan fashion. They were soft, luminous, and tragically difficult to obtain, which made them irresistible to a queen who built her brand on unattainable perfection. Elizabeth I wore pearls on her gowns, in her hair, on her shoes, and even sewn into her gloves. Courtiers followed suit, draping themselves in layers of pearlescent symbolism until they resembled walking oysters. Pearls were the sacred badge of the Virgin Queen, so naturally, every noble lady scrambled to wear enough of them to look appropriately chaste, albeit while fainting under the weight. But Tudor jewellery wasn't limited to gender or delicacy. Men too were magpies of magnificence. A nobleman's chain wasn't just an accessory, it was his resume. Massive gold chains of office were draped across chests like portable thrones, each link thick enough to double as armour. Portraits of Henry VIII and his courtiers show them wearing layers of chain that could probably anchor a small ship. Rings adorned every finger, sometimes 2 or 3 deep, each bearing crests, cameos, or cabochons the size of gooseberries. Earrings became increasingly fashionable for men as well, with pirates and princes alike dangling gems from their lobes as if to remind the world, yes, I'm dangerous but also tasteful. And oh, the rings. They weren't just decoration, they were statements, symbols, and occasionally security devices. Signet rings bore family crests used to seal letters, making them the Tudor equivalent of both a credit card and a password. Lose your ring, and someone could literally impersonate you in ink. Lovers exchanged rings engraved with mottos like "Thine forever," or "As endureth the diamond." Some even contained hidden compartments, tiny spaces for keepsakes, poison, or relics of dubious holiness. Tudor jewellery was part fashion, part spycraft. Among the most intimate and fascinating of all accessories was portrait miniatures, the Renaissance's answer to the profile picture. These tiny hand-painted likenesses were often encased in gold lockets, worn close to the heart, and given as tokens of affection, loyalty, or subtle political manipulation. Elizabeth I just popularised the trend by gifting miniature portraits of herself to favoured courtiers. It was the ultimate royal flex. You might not see the Queen often, but you could literally carry her face over your heart, just in case you forgot who ran your life. These miniatures weren't crude sketches, they were masterpieces. Artists like Nicholas Hilliard and Isaac Oliver specialised in rendering faces with exquisite precision, often framed by gems, enamel, and filigree. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. These weren't portraits, they were devotional icons. Courtiers displayed them in private chambers, whispered over them like relics, and occasionally hid them under layers of clothing for discreet adoration. You could say Tudor jewellery was sentimental, but only if your sentiments cost a year's income. But beyond symbolism and romance lay something far more pragmatic. Money. In a world without modern banking, jewellery was portable wealth, an investment that glittered in public while doubling as a savings account. Gold chains, jewelled belts, and gem-studded brooches were a noble's way of keeping their assets close, literally on their person. You didn't need to visit a banker when your fortune was dangling from your hat. In times of financial distress, which was often, given the Tudor addiction to overspending, nobles pawned their jewels to stay afloat. Whole estates were mortgaged for a necklace. The trade behind this opulence was immense. Goldsmiths and jewellers were among the most influential craftsmen in England, many operating in London's Cheapside district. These artisans were masters of delicate deceit, able to rework outdated jewellery into new shapes, or disguise cracked gemstones with cunning settings. Their shops gleamed with imported stones from India, Persia, and the New World. Traders risked their lives to bring emeralds from Colombia, pearls from the Arabian Gulf, and diamonds from far-off mines. A Tudor noble's collection was an atlas of empire disguised as fashion, and the designs themselves were gloriously unrestrained. Pendants came in the shapes of ships, hearts, skulls, mermaids, and mythological beasts. Religious motifs abounded. Crosses, angels, and miniature reliquaries designed to hold sacred fragments, or so one hoped. The Tudors also adored posy jewellery, inscribed with poetic phrases or moral reminders like "Remember thy end" or "Virtue above wealth," a brave sentiment coming from someone wearing a sapphire the size of a dove's egg. Women often wore chains of jewels woven directly into their hair, while elaborate girdles, belt-like ornaments, hung heavy with golden tassels, perfume cases, and trinkets. Even shoe buckles could be gem-encrusted. To the Tudors, moderation was not elegance, it was failure. One French visitor, upon seeing Elizabeth's court, dryly noted that the English shine brighter than their candlesticks. Of course, all that brilliance had its hazards. Theft was a constant concern, servants were frisked, chests locked, and some nobles slept with their jewellery under their pillows. The tiniest misplaced gem could trigger an investigation worthy of a Shakespearean tragedy, but paranoia was the price of magnificence, and magnificence above all was the point. Jewellery was more than vanity. It was identity, status, faith, and liquidity, all rolled into one glittering package. The Tudors wore their ambition openly, each gem a declaration of dominance. Even in death, they refused to let go. Portraits show nobles buried with rings, rosaries, and crosses, ensuring they entered the afterlife as dazzling as they'd lived. So when we marvel at their portraits, the ropes of pearls, the gold filigree, the rubies glowing like coals, it's worth remembering this wasn't just fashion, it was a financial strategy with better lighting. Tudor nobles didn't save for retirement, they wore it, shined it, and occasionally pawned it. Because in an age where status sparkled, being dull wasn't just unfashionable, it was unthinkable. If the Tudors had a motto for personal grooming, it would have been something like, "God gave us hair, but the devil invented stock." In a society obsessed with status and spectacle, even the strands on your head, or the ones you glued there, were political statements. Hair wasn't just hair, it was identity, propaganda, and often a public hazard. If your beard didn't look like a ship under sail, were you even trying? Let's begin with hair colour, that great obsession of Elizabethan England. While most Europeans were content to let nature take its course, the Tudors saw hair as an aesthetic battlefield. Queen Elizabeth I, as always, set the tone, literally. Her famously copper-red locks became the defining shade of royal approval. Naturally red hair was rare and considered a mark of divine blessing, so courtiers promptly decided that if God wouldn't make them redheads, chemistry would. The results were both glorious and ghastly. Recipes for hair dye read like witchcraft manuals, alum, sulphur, and quicklime boiled with saffron and honey, or worse, a combination of lye and urine left to ferment in the sun. The goal was a glowing auburn hue. The result was often chemical warfare. Scalps burned, hair disintegrated, and servants were blamed for mishandling the elixir. Still, nobles persisted. because nothing said loyalty to the crown like risking baldness in the name of matching the Queen. Those who couldn't achieve Elizabethan red turned to the next best thing, wigs. The 16th century saw the birth of the English wig industry, fueled by imported hair from across Europe. Italian merchants shipped fine blonde hair from Venice, while darker locks came from Spain and France. Wigs, or perukes, were the status symbols, each styled into intricate curls or rolls. They were perfumed, powdered, and sometimes gilded. The most extravagant versions used horsehair or silk thread, sculpted to sit like crowns atop the head. For men, wigs served another purpose, concealing the ravages of syphilis, a disease rampant in Tudor England that often caused hair loss. A full head of curls was not just fashionable, it was alibi hair. Henry VIII, in his later years, likely used wigs to disguise thinning patches, and Elizabeth I herself resorted to them as she aged, transforming her natural hair loss into an ever-expanding collection of fiery red masterpieces. Each wig was numbered, named, and maintained like a national treasure. Of course, a wig was only half the battle. The true test of Tudor masculinity was the beard. In an age before electric razors, or arguably taste, facial hair was the Tudor man's greatest source of pride. Clean-shaven faces were for priests, adolescents, and the French. A real man's beard announced virility, power, and possibly what he had for breakfast. The Elizabethan beard scene was as competitive as any joust, except with more wax and less armour. Beards came in every imaginable shape and level of impracticality. There was the stiletto beard, sharp and pointed, the spade beard, broad and flat, the forked beard, split like a serpent's tongue, and the cat's tail. Don't ask. The longer and more symmetrical, the better. Courtiers spent hours grooming, trimming, and oiling their whiskers, ensuring that each hair stood at attention like soldiers awaiting inspection. Beard maintenance was an art form. Men used combs made of ivory or bone, and pomades crafted from beeswax and scented oils. Barbers, who doubled as surgeons and dentists, offered full-service treatments, shaving, bleeding, and occasionally removing teeth if you complained too much. A good barber was worth his weight in gold. A bad one might leave you half-shaved and wholly humiliated. The colour of one's beard mattered too. Red was considered particularly virile, black conveyed gravity, and gold suggested nobility. Some men dyed their facial hair with saffron or soot mixed with oil, while others used a risky brew of copper and vinegar for that perfect golden hue. The results varied from impressive to apocalyptic, but the ambition was admirable. And yes, beard fashion could get political. In one of history's stranger power plays, Henry VIII once taxed beards, using them as a literal revenue stream. The more prominent your facial hair, the higher your fee, because clearly nothing said royal policy like monetizing masculinity. By Elizabeth's time, however, beards had become cultural landmarks. Poets like Edmund Spenser praised them in verse, and portraits of courtiers featured whiskers so artfully painted they could double as landscapes. Women, meanwhile, had their own grooming rituals. They plucked hairlines high to create the coveted, noble forehead, a look achieved by forcefully evicting half your scalp. Foreheads were meant to appear vast, smooth, and intellectual, as if one's thoughts needed extra parking space. Eyebrows were plucked into oblivion or painted faintly with soot and vinegar. Queen Elizabeth again led by example. Her famously high hairline became the fashion template for an entire generation of women willing to suffer for forehead supremacy. The obsession with grooming birthed an entire sub-economy. Perfumers, barbers, wig makers, and apothecaries grew rich off the vanity of the elite. Imported combs, brushes, and scented waters filled noble dressing tables. Mirrors, still expensive luxury items, became household trophies, their polished surfaces reflecting both beauty and delusion. The Tudors were the first English generation to make self-grooming a spectator sport. And then there were the hat wars, a parallel battle to the beard arms race. A Tudor nobleman never appeared bareheaded. His hat announced his rank, wealth, and mood, often adorned with feathers, jewels and gold thread. To remove your hat in the Queen's presence was an act of reverence. To forget to remove it was an act of suicide. Hats and hair worked in unison. A finely curled wig crowned with ostrich plumes could add a full foot to one's height. Tudor men didn't just walk into rooms, they ascended into them. But all this grooming came at a cost. Maintaining wigs required perfuming to mask the smell of old sweat and candle smoke, while beard wax could melt during summer feasts, creating awkward drips. And the hair dyes? Let's just say not everyone survived their commitment to fashion. Chronic mercury poisoning was practically a prerequisite for court attendance. Still, for all its absurdity, Tudor grooming served a higher purpose. In an era where appearance equaled influence, every curl and every beard hair was part of a grand visual performance. A well-styled wig or a gleaming beard wasn't vanity, it was armour. You weren't just presenting yourself to society, you were defending your status with combs and curling irons. The Tudors turned grooming into spectacle, self-promotion, and occasionally self-destruction. They saw hair not as a feature, but as a flag, one that needed to be visible from across the Great Hall. Whether it was Elizabeth's celestial wigs, or a courtier's wind-resistant beard, one truth remained eternal. In Tudor England, the head wasn't just for thinking, it was for showing off. If your beard didn't look like a ship under sail, were you even trying? Diplomacy in the Tudor age wasn't fought on battlefields alone. It unfolded in silk-draped throne rooms, beneath candlelight with lace cuffs and daggered smiles. Where modern politics has summits and treaties, the Tudors had sleeves and embroidery. In a world where power was woven as much as written, clothing was soft diplomacy. Spies didn't just carry coded letters, they wore them. The Cold War had nukes, the Tudors had doublets. The English court was a stage, but it was far from the only one. Across Europe, monarchs competed not only for territory, but for aesthetic dominance. The courts of France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire were rival catwalks of political theatre. Every colour, gemstone, and imported fabric was a calculated statement of influence. When ambassadors arrived from abroad, the first thing they noticed wasn't the architecture or the food, it was the wardrobe. How you dressed told other nations everything they needed to know: wealth, ambition, military confidence, or financial ruin disguised as velvet. Henry VIII understood this game better than anyone. He treated diplomacy like a Renaissance fashion duel. His meeting with Francis III of France in 1520, known as the Field of the Cloth of Gold, was the most extravagant flex in European history. The event was ostensibly a peace summit, but in truth, it was a runway showdown. Henry and Francis tried to outshine each other through sheer textile aggression. England built temporary palaces draped in cloth of gold, while the French imported fountains that literally spouted wine. One chronicler wrote that no field ever saw more gold nor less humility. Henry appeared in gowns embroidered with jewels so bright that one eyewitness claimed they flashed like the sun. Behind the brocade, however, there was espionage. Courtiers were not just attendees, they were fashion spies. Ambassadors observed every detail of foreign dress, reporting back to their sovereigns about what was in vogue abroad. If the French court started wearing puffed sleeves, England followed within a month. If the Spanish queen favoured black silk with jewelled girdles, Elizabeth's ladies mirrored it within weeks. Information about fabric imports, tailors and dye merchants flowed as swiftly as rumours of alliances. It wasn't mere vanity, it was intelligence gathering. Knowing what your rivals wore meant knowing where their money went. Did Spain's nobles switch from silk to wool? That hinted at economic pressure. Did the French suddenly appear in sombre black? Perhaps the court was in mourning or simply signalling piety to the Pope. Even the shade of a king's cloak could be interpreted as policy. Diplomatic correspondence from the period reads like reports from a Renaissance Vogue magazine. The Duke of Guise hath appeared in scarlet and gold, which colour he doth not use save when fortune smiles upon him. Elizabeth I weaponised fashion espionage with ruthless precision. Her spies didn't just eavesdrop on political discussions, they attended foreign banquets, took notes on fabrics, and occasionally bribed tailors to send sketches of new continental trends. England's growing textile trade relied heavily on this flow of information. To stay ahead in the style race was to assert dominance without drawing a sword. The Queen even used clothing to destabilise others. She'd send gifts of outdated fashions to rival monarchs, ensuring they appeared unfashionable in their own courts. Subtle? No. Effective? Absolutely. Ambassadors too became fashion warriors. They were expected to dress as magnificently as the monarch they represented, often at personal expense. When the Spanish envoy appeared before Elizabeth, his doublet gleamed with jewels from Seville, each one a subtle reminder of Spain's global empire. Not to be outdone, Elizabeth's courtiers would respond with English pearls and cloth of silver, a glittering argument that England's growing naval power could rival Spain's wealth. Negotiations took place beneath chandeliers, but were fought in thread and trim. In many ways, fashion became the secret language of diplomacy. Certain motifs carried hidden meanings. A gown embroidered with olive branches might suggest peace. A surcoat lined with ermine implied moral virtue. Even the type of fabric could signal political alliances. Italian silk spoke of continental trade. English wool signified patriotic pride. When ambassadors exchanged gifts, these textiles acted as coded messages. Receiving a cloak of Spanish velvet wasn't just a luxury, it was a subtle reminder that you were wrapped, quite literally, in Spain's influence. But beneath the sparkle there was paranoia. Monarchs feared that tailors could be bribed to plant listening devices. Well, metaphorically speaking, tailors were everywhere, stitching, gossiping and delivering garments to chambers where secrets were whispered. The Elizabethan spymaster Sir Francis Walsingham famously recruited informants from all levels of society, including jewellers, cloth merchants and wig makers. These tradespeople travelled between noble households, carrying not only fabrics but rumours. Spying, after all, was just another kind of tailoring, cutting, fitting and revealing what others tried to hide. The rivalry extended to entire nations. Spanish fashion leaned towards sombre formality, dark colours, stiff collars, and minimal ornamentation. It reflected Spain's religious austerity and imperial gravitas. French fashion, meanwhile, was exuberant. Lace, slashed sleeves, and flirtatious ruffs that seemed to defy gravity and reason. The English style landed somewhere between, ostentatious but strategic. Elizabeth's court adopted French silhouettes, Italian fabrics, and Spanish restraint, creating a hybrid look that was both cosmopolitan and uniquely English. If fashion were a diplomatic treaty, hers was perfectly negotiated. Foreign visitors often found England's sartorial swagger both impressive and alarming. The Venetian ambassador complained that the English lords ruined themselves upon their apparel, changing fashions faster than reason. The Spanish envoys, meanwhile, suspected that the English obsession with fashion was an elaborate cover for espionage. And, to be fair, they weren't entirely wrong. Several known spies used clothing deliveries as excuses to smuggle letters and coded tokens. A particularly inventive case involved a tailor's dummy stuffed with secret correspondence, sent as a gift to the French ambassador. One wonders if the poor dummy ever made it home. Even within the English court, fashion diplomacy was an arms race. Courtiers monitored one another's outfits the way modern politicians monitor polls. Wearing a new cut or fabric before the Queen had blessed it was social suicide. Falling behind on a trend might make you appear foreign. Worse, unpatriotic. But wearing the right colour at the right moment could turn you into a national hero. When Elizabeth wore white to celebrate a naval victory over Spain, her ladies-in-waiting followed suit, creating a dazzling wall of symbolism. Purity, triumph and unity stitched in silk. In short, fashion wasn't just decoration, it was strategy. It could flatter, insult or intimidate. Monarchs used it to broadcast stability or conceal weakness. Ambassadors wielded it as persuasion, while spies used it as camouflage. The Tudor court didn't need hidden microphones when a ruff's fabric count could reveal a nation's economy. So while modern diplomacy hides behind tailored suits and careful phrasing, the Tudors preferred something more theatrical. Every sleeve, gem and ribbon was a declaration. Alliances were woven, rivalries embroidered, and secrets stitched into seams. In the Tudor world, to dress was to declare war, silently, elegantly, and with impeccable taste. The Cold War had nukes. The Tudors had doublets. For Tudor nobles, fashion wasn't just expensive, it was a financial death spiral lined with velvet. Behind every glittering gown and jewelled doublet lay a mountain of debt tall enough to block out the sun. Nobles mortgaged lands, borrowed from merchants, and sold ancestral estates, all for the privilege of shimmering briefly before bankruptcy. They didn't lose their shirts, they sold their manners to buy new ones. You see, in the Tudor world, appearances weren't optional, they were currency. Your social survival depended on how convincingly you could look richer than you actually were. It was the 16th century equivalent of taking out 10 loans for a car, just because the king might see you driving it. Courtiers lived in a constant dangerous performance. Each banquet, each procession, each court appearance was a fashion duel to the death. And losing didn't just mean humiliation, it could mean political extinction. Let's start with the numbers, because they're staggering. A single noble outfit, complete with embroidered doublets, silk hose, jewelled belt, and fur-lined cloak, could cost more than a skilled craftsman earned in a decade. Imported silk from Italy and velvet from Flanders were luxuries that required entire trade routes to support. Add in the cost of dyes, the good ones were made from crushed insects or rare minerals, plus the tailor's fee, and your wardrobe could easily match the value of a small estate. Some nobles reportedly spent a third of their annual income on clothing alone. And then there was the upkeep. Owning fine garments was only half the battle, you had to maintain them. Starchers, laundresses, and wardrobe attendants were on permanent standby, working through the night to clean, iron, and restore garments for the next morning's display. One noble woman's inventory lists 40 gowns, each with its own set of accessories and servants dedicated to caring for them. That's not fashion, it's an employment scheme. To make matters worse, fashions changed at dizzying speed. A cut that was in vogue at Easter could be out of favour by Christmas. When Queen Elizabeth appeared in a new style, courtiers scrambled to imitate it within days. There was no resting on your laurels or your lace. A noble who failed to keep up with current fashion risked being labelled backward, provincial, or worst of all, poor. You couldn't just wear wealth, you had to continually reinvest in it. This created a perfect storm of vanity and debt. Nobles who once prided themselves on vast estates found themselves pawning family heirlooms and borrowing from the rising class of London merchants, men who had the money but not the titles. It was an ironic reversal. The merchants funded the nobility's finery, while the nobility sneered at them for lacking pedigree. One merchant reportedly quipped, "We lend them gold for their hose, and they lend us their names for our doors." Debt became as fashionable as pearls. Courtiers borrowed money to buy outfits that would impress the Queen, in hopes that the Queen would reward them with positions or lands that could pay off the debt. It was a glittering Ponzi scheme in ruffs and brocade. Some succeeded, earning royal favour could indeed change one's fortune. But many more failed, sinking into quiet ruin while still looking fabulous. Henry VIII's own wardrobe addiction set the tone. The king's personal clothing budget could have funded an army. By his later years, his garments filled several vast wardrobes at Hampton Court, each packed with hundreds of outfits embroidered with jewels, gold thread, and fur. His courtiers, desperate to match his grandeur, followed suit, literally. Maintaining royal proximity meant matching royal splendour, even if it meant selling your ancestral orchard to buy a single crimson velvet coat. The fashion industry, because yes, it was already an industry, thrived on this madness. Tailors, silkmen, goldsmiths and jewellers extended endless lines of credit to noble clients who paid in promises rather than pounds. Whole workshops operated on the assumption that the Duke of so-and-so might pay next year, assuming he hadn't been executed or exiled in the meantime. Lawsuits over unpaid tailoring bills clogged Tudor courts. One London tailor left behind a ledger reading like a social register of delinquent debtors, earls, countesses, bishops and ambassadors, all fabulously dressed, none of them solvent. Women fared no better. Elizabethan ladies spent small fortunes on jewels, perfumes, wigs, and embroidery, each one a silent competition to prove worthiness in the Queen's orbit. Many aristocratic widows were left destitute, their estates swallowed by unpaid fashion debts. One letter from 1590 laments, "My late husband hath left me but gowns and creditors." Another widow sold her jewels to buy mourning clothes to honour the husband whose debts had bankrupted her. In Tudor England, even tragedy had a dress code. And yet the cycle endured, because to stop spending was to admit defeat. A noble stripped of elegance was stripped of relevance. The court was a glittering illusion, and everyone inside it was trapped by the same lie, that silk equalled status and fur equalled favour. The crown itself encouraged this behaviour. Elizabeth knew that bankrupt courtiers made loyal courtiers. After all, a man who owed his appearance to royal approval wasn't likely to rebel against it. The fallout extended beyond individuals. Entire estates were ruined by fashion fever. Lands that had supported families for generations were sold to pay for the next season's wardrobe. Country houses fell into disrepair as their owners poured funds into sleeves and shoes. The wealth of the Tudor aristocracy quite literally shifted from stone walls to stitched seams. Some historians have argued that this self-inflicted financial implosion helped pave the way for the rise of England's merchant class, who bought up the nobles' foreclosed lands and eventually reshaped society. In other words, vanity was the great redistributor. But the irony runs deeper still. The very merchants the nobles looked down upon were the ones growing rich off their ruin. The more nobles spent, the more the craftsmen thrived. Starchers, dyers, weavers, goldsmiths, all prospered under the heavy embroidered boots of their betters. Tudor fashion didn't just decorate society, it quietly rewired it. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, England glittered like a jewel box, and half the people inside it were broke. The courtiers looked divine, the portraits immortalised them in silk and pearls, and the bills remained unpaid. Behind every gleaming collar and shimmering ruff was a trail of IOUs and pawn tickets. The Tudors had turned fashion into a form of economic roulette. Everyone was betting on appearances, and almost everyone lost. But at least they lost beautifully. They didn't lose their shirts. They sold their manners to buy new ones. While nobles were busy stitching their fortunes into sleeves, another group quietly took control of the real economy, the merchants. These were the shrewd traders, tailors and cloth dealers of Tudor England who discovered a simple truth. Vanity was the most reliable business model ever invented. As nobles competed to outshine each other in silk and pearls, merchants sold them the rope to hang their bank accounts with. The first Black Friday sale was just a noble pawning his cloak. In the bustling heart of London, Cheapside, Lombard Street and St Paul's Yard, a new kind of empire was rising. The old nobility had titles, but the merchants had ledgers. They dealt in everything from imported silks and Italian lace to ostrich feathers and Flemish velvet. For the first time, luxury became a commodity, and the Tudor merchant class was ready to sell it to anyone foolish or fashionable enough to buy. The textile trade was the golden thread running through Tudor commerce. England's wool had long been the envy of Europe, but under the Tudors the trade evolved from exporting raw wool to producing finished cloth. This shift turned London into a textile capital, buzzing with weavers, dyers and cloth merchants. Bolts of fabric lined the stalls like rainbow battalions, scarlet from Kerm's beetles, blue from indigo, black from iron-rich dye vats. The smells of lanolin, vinegar, and hot dye mingled in the air like the perfume of capitalism. Merchants weren't just sellers, they were curators of dreams. They knew their customers intimately. A courtier didn't want fabric, he wanted envy. A countess didn't need lace, she needed social ammunition. The merchant's job was to translate insecurity into invoices. As one 16th century trader reportedly boasted, "I sell not cloth, but confidence." Every shop window was a trap for the anxious elite, offering salvation in satin form. Credit was their secret weapon. Nobles, too proud to admit poverty, relied heavily on loans from clothiers and goldsmiths. Merchants extended lines of credit with the precision of sharks circling a wounded whale. They knew their clients couldn't resist another velvet doublet or embroidered gown for the next royal feast. It didn't matter if repayment took years or never came at all. The longer the noble stayed in debt, the more influence the merchant gained. This quiet power shift terrified the aristocracy. For centuries, the English social order had been clear. Land equalled status. But the Tudor era flipped that logic on its jewelled head. The merchant class began to live like nobles, building grand houses, wearing imported fabrics, and commissioning portraits in imitation of the aristocracy. They didn't need bloodlines when they had balance sheets. Theirs was a new kind of nobility, one measured not by lineage, but by ledger. Many merchants became extraordinarily rich. The great London mercer Sir Thomas Gresham, for example, amassed such wealth through trade and finance that he founded the Royal Exchange in 1565, the world's first modern stock exchange. It became the new temple of Tudor ambition, where merchants gathered beneath gilded ceilings to trade futures, fabrics, and fortunes. Meanwhile, nobles, whose family estates had been mortgaged to fund their wardrobes, walked those same halls in disguised desperation, negotiating with the very men who'd once served them. Fashion accelerated this economic inversion. Every time the Queen wore a new gown, an entire market trembled with opportunity. Merchants rushed to replicate the royal look for courtiers desperate to keep up. A single new sleeve design could set off a frenzy in Cheapside. Silk merchants hoarded stock, tailors raised prices, and dyers worked through the night. In modern terms, it was the Elizabethan version of a viral trend, except instead of influencers, you had dukes fainting into debt. But merchants weren't just profiteers, they were innovators. To keep up with demand, they built sophisticated supply chains stretching across Europe. English wool went to Flanders for weaving, Italian dyers added colour, and French embroiderers finished the work. Ships returned to London carrying the world's luxuries: Venetian glass buttons, Spanish silk, Baltic furs and Indian cotton. Each item passed through the merchants' hands, each transaction fattening their purses. For every noble who ruined himself at court, 10 traders bought new carriages, and the merchants understood the psychology of the age better than anyone. They marketed scarcity. A bolt of velvet wasn't merely expensive, it was fit for a queen. A pair of perfumed gloves wasn't just scented, it was the very fashion worn in Madrid. Their advertisements, delivered verbally of course by smooth-talking apprentices, promised exclusivity and prestige. Nobles, terrified of appearing outdated, swallowed the bait every time. This feverish consumerism birthed something England had never seen before: conspicuous retail culture. Market days in London turned into spectacles. Foreign visitors described the shops of Cheapside as a paradise of treasures, where even middle-class citizens browsed luxury goods once reserved for royalty. Merchants began displaying wares in elaborate arrangements to lure passers-by, a primitive but effective form of window shopping. For the first time, shopping itself became an act of social aspiration. The church, of course, hated it. Preachers thundered from pulpits that greed and vanity were corrupting the soul of the nation. They weren't entirely wrong. Merchants used moral language to justify profit, claiming they were serving God's providence by providing fine goods to his favoured elite. One particularly bold pamphlet even argued that luxurious clothing uplifted the realm's dignity. Translation: if we're all broke, at least we look amazing. Still, not all merchants were villains. Some were self-made success stories who brought economic vitality to England. The Tudor state relied heavily on them, financing wars, supplying armies, and managing royal credit. In fact, when Elizabeth needed money to fund her navy, she borrowed from the very same merchant bankers who were also outfitting her courtiers in imported lace. The merchant class wasn't just selling goods anymore, they were underwriting the monarchy. Yet the tension between wealth and birth persisted. Nobles sneered at the upstart traders, even as they begged them for loans. Elizabeth herself walked the tightrope carefully, rewarding merchants for their loyalty but ensuring they never forgot their place. The merchants in turn smiled, bowed, and raised the prices on her courtiers' silk. By the end of the 16th century, England's economic soul had shifted. The age of landed wealth was fading, replaced by an age of liquid capital. The merchant class had transformed fashion into a financial empire, one transaction at a time. They discovered the eternal truth of every economy since. The rich will always pay anything to look richer. In Tudor England, power wore a doublet and carried a debt ledger. The nobles dazzled in borrowed finery. The merchants bought the world. And as one wit observed, the crown may rule the realm, but Cheapside rules the court. The first Black Friday sale was just a noble pawning his cloak. By the late Tudor era, England was suffering from a national identity crisis, specifically a fashion identity crisis. Everyone wanted to look noble, whether or not they could afford to spell noble. Merchants, lawyers, and newly prosperous tradesmen all decided that birthright was overrated and velvet was the true mark of destiny. But imitating nobility came with a price, financial, legal, and occasionally fatal. Everyone wanted to look noble, until the bill arrived. The explosion of wealth in Tudor towns had created a new middle-class flush with ambition and disposable income. These weren't peasants, they were shopkeepers, brewers, clothiers, and ship owners who had made fortunes from trade. Their houses grew larger, their tables fuller, and their wardrobes inevitably richer. The old aristocracy sneered at them for lacking pedigree, but the merchants had a counter-argument. They had cash flow, and with that cash came temptation. If a duke could strut around in imported silk and cloth of gold, why couldn't a merchant's wife wear the same? Why should only the nobility get to jingle when they walked? Social mobility might have been limited in Tudor England, but sartorial mobility was another story entirely. The rising middle class began dressing like the upper crust, and the upper crust, predictably, panicked. Enter the sumptuary laws, England's official attempt to stop the social order from unravelling into a fashion free-for-all. These laws, updated repeatedly during the reigns of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, were less about morality and more about panic. They dictated who could wear what: silk and velvet for the nobility, satin for knights and esquires, and good, honest wool for everyone else. Even colours were regulated. Purple was reserved for royalty, crimson for the aristocracy, and black, the most expensive dye of all, was to be worn only by those who could actually afford to mourn their finances. Of course, the problem with legislating fashion is that people rarely obey it, especially when the laws are designed to remind them they aren't good enough. The middle class became experts in creative loopholes. A merchant's wife might wear silk trimmings instead of a full silk gown. A lawyer might line his cloak with velvet but claim it didn't count if it wasn't visible. A tailor might discreetly replace forbidden Italian lace with a local imitation and swear under oath it was English thread. Everyone pretended to follow the rules, and no one did. London's markets became ground zero for this quiet rebellion. In the stalls of Cheapside you could buy look-alike luxury, fabrics dyed to resemble forbidden hues, imitation gems made of coloured glass, and embroidery so fine it fooled half the court. Enterprising merchants marketed these knockoffs as inspired by courtly fashion, the Elizabethan equivalent of a knockoff handbag. Tudor society had discovered counterfeit chic, and business was booming. The moralists naturally lost their minds. Preachers thundered from pulpits that England was drowning in sin, that tailors stitched the pride of Lucifer into every garment. One furious bishop complained that even fishmongers' wives walk in silks as though they were queens of the Indies. Pamphleteers published tirades condemning the monstrous confusion of estates, meaning that one could no longer tell a gentleman from a grocer, to which the grocers likely replied, "Good." But it wasn't just about vanity, it was about survival. The expanding economy meant social mobility was possible, but fragile. A successful merchant or lawyer might attend court or dine with nobility, where appearing underdressed could destroy his credibility. To dress like the elite wasn't rebellion, it was self-preservation. The Tudor world was an optical illusion. Status had to be performed to be believed. Tailors, those silent power brokers of fashion, became the middle class's secret allies. They worked miracles of suggestion, adding a gold thread here, a subtle puff there, crafting garments that whispered gentleman without shouting criminal. Some even kept two ledgers, one for legal commissions and one for special requests. When questioned by authorities, they feigned innocence, claiming ignorance of their client's rank. "Oh, I thought he was a baron, sir." He certainly paid like one. Enforcement of the sumptuary laws was a farce. Inspectors were few, bribes were plentiful, and everyone had an excuse. One merchant fined for wearing silk claimed it was a gift from his dead brother and thus an inheritance, not a luxury. Another defended his crimson cloak by insisting it was faded brown when purchased. Even the Queen's courtiers quietly admitted that the laws were impossible to enforce. After all, if half of London was breaking the rules, whom could you punish without collapsing the economy? The irony was delicious. The laws designed to preserve hierarchy ended up blurring it. By the 1580s, middle-class families were attending church and civic events in gowns and doublets indistinguishable from those of minor nobles. Wealth had rewritten the visual language of class. As one contemporary observer put it, the world is turned upside down for merchants dress as lords and lords as kings, and the nobles, they were furious, but also trapped. To maintain their distinction, they had to spend even more on ever-grander clothing. Every imitation from below forced the upper class to escalate, commissioning new cuts, rarer fabrics, and more elaborate jewellery. It was a social arms race fought with embroidery needles. The middle class might have been pretending, but the aristocracy was bankrupting itself to stay ahead of the illusion. Even Queen Elizabeth herself played both sides. She publicly supported the sumptuary laws, declaring that subjects must know their degree, but privately she adored the spectacle. A glittering society reflected her own magnificence. If merchants wanted to look like nobles, she reasoned, let them, so long as everyone remembered who set the standard. The Queen was the sun, and the rest of England merely dressed in her reflected light. By the end of her reign, the distinction between noble and merchant had blurred beyond recognition. Wealth had become the new bloodline. The children of successful tradesmen married into old families desperate for cash, cementing the first wave of England's genteel capitalism, where class wasn't inherited but bought, sewn and starched into being. Counterfeit chic wasn't just a fashion trend. It was a quiet revolution stitched into the seams of Tudor society. The old order tried to legislate appearance, but the new order understood the truth. Appearance was the new order. Silk and lace became weapons of social advancement, and imitation was the sincerest and most profitable form of flattery. In the end, the middle class won the long game. Their imitation became normalisation. Their spending habits became the foundation of England's early consumer culture. The nobles sneered, but they also sold their estates to the very people they mocked. Everyone wanted to look noble until the bill arrived. In the grand, glittering theatre of Tudor fashion, someone always had to play the supporting cast, the servants, tailors, and hand-me-down heroes who kept the show running. For every duke dazzling in embroidered velvet, there was a servant somewhere quietly inheriting his last season's regrets. Nobles' wardrobes may have been monuments to vanity, but when the debts came calling, their discarded finery found new life in the hands and on the backs of those who could never afford it firsthand. If your master went broke, at least you got a free doublet. Tudor England had a thriving second-hand clothing economy long before thrift shops and vintage boutiques made it fashionable. It was a world of resale, repair, and resourcefulness, born out of both necessity and opportunity. Nobles, ever hungry for the latest imported silks or royal-approved sleeve shapes, shed clothing at a terrifying rate. A gown worn twice to court was already old news. A doublet with last month's embroidery pattern might as well have been medieval. But nothing went to waste, not when fabric was worth more than furniture. Enter the servants, who stood at the crossroads between aristocratic opulence and working-class reality. Livery servants, footmen, valets, chambermaids, and ladies' attendants were often paid in a peculiar currency, clothes. Instead of money, or alongside it, nobles gifted them cast-off garments as part of their wages. It was the Tudor version of a company bonus, except instead of cash, you got your employer's slightly wine-stained brocade. These hand-me-downs were far from useless. A nobleman's discarded cloak could be altered, patched, or trimmed into something wearable for a servant's daily use. A lady's outdated gown could be dismantled and refitted into multiple simpler dresses. Even the leftover fabric scraps were valuable. Nothing in the Tudor wardrobe truly died. It was reincarnated. Servants learned to become skilled recyclers, cutting grand fashion down to manageable reality. But the real magic happened outside the manor walls, in the bustling alleys of London's second-hand markets. Places like Thames Street, Long Lane and St Paul's Churchyard were filled with stalls and peddlers hawking pre-owned finery. The trade was so vibrant that it had its own nickname, the rag trade, though rag was often an understatement. Among the moth-eaten and patched garments were treasures: velvet gowns, fur-trimmed cloaks, and doublets that once graced royal banquets. Street vendors, known as fripperers, were the original thrift store entrepreneurs. They bought cast-offs from servants or directly from indebted nobles, cleaned them, well, sort of, and resold them to merchants, clerks, or anyone with dreams of looking a little more important than they actually were. Fripperers were skilled negotiators with a nose for both profit and perfume. They knew exactly how to turn yesterday's court fashion into tomorrow's payday. The trade even had its own hierarchy. At the top were the high-end dealers, operating discreetly near the royal court or noble estates. They handled luxurious goods, embroidered doublets, jewelled girdles, lace collars, and often counted courtiers among their clients. Below them were the street sellers, whose stalls overflowed with mismatched hose, patched jerkins, and faded caps. Down another rung were the rag pickers, who scavenged scraps to sell to tailors for mending or repurposing. In a sense, this was the birth of consumer recycling. Clothes moved down the social ladder in a kind of sartorial trickle-down economy, from monarch to noble, from noble to servant, from servant to street market, and finally to labourers and apprentices. Even the humblest cobbler might wear a jacket that had once belonged to a lord, albeit shortened, re-dyed, and missing a few buttons of actual gold. Tudor society, ever obsessed with appearances, thus found a strange kind of equality. Everyone could look a little grander, even if it was in someone else's sleeves. But the second-hand trade wasn't just about economics, it was also about survival. Clothing was expensive and new fabric was a luxury most people could never dream of buying. A decent wool gown might cost several weeks' wages. For servants and townsfolk, buying second-hand was the only way to participate in the great Tudor dress-up. A man could walk into a market in rough linen and leave looking like he might have attended university, or at least stolen from someone who had. Of course, not everyone was thrilled about this democratization of style. The authorities, always anxious about class boundaries, viewed the resale market with suspicion. The sumptuary laws had already made it illegal for commoners to wear certain fabrics and colours, yet the second-hand market made enforcement nearly impossible. How could a constable tell whether a servant wearing velvet had purchased it unlawfully or received it as wages? For every decree restricting luxury goods, there was a fripperer in London finding a clever way to resell them anyway. In fact, the government occasionally cracked down on the trade, not for fashion crimes, but for hygiene. Used clothing, especially imported silks and furs, could carry fleas, lice and disease. During outbreaks of the plague, second-hand markets were accused of spreading infection. This did little to stop the trade, however. A plague was temporary, but style was eternal. People were willing to risk a few fleas for a good deal on an Italian doublet. Servants, for their part, walked a fine line between gratitude and ambition. For many, cast-off clothes were not just payment but social opportunity. A well-dressed valet might attract better employment. A lady's maid with fine lace might catch the eye of a merchant. Clothing was social currency, and even second-hand silk spent well. Some servants even became mini-entrepreneurs, selling their hand-me-downs for profit in the city markets. A few built enough wealth this way to rise into the burgeoning middle class, living proof that one man's old cloak could be another's fortune. And let's not forget the humour of it all. Nobles parading around in fresh finery, oblivious that their discarded garments were about to begin new lives as someone else's treasure. Imagine a lord's horror discovering his former valet strutting through Cheapside in last season's doublet, or a baroness spotting her old gown, now red-eyed blue, being worn by a brewer's wife at Sunday service. The Tudor world was small, and so were its secrets. By the late 1500s, the resale market had become an institution. Whole families made their living buying, repairing and reselling clothes. It was the Tudor precursor to capitalism's grandest trick, turning yesterday's waste into today's profit. In a society where every thread carried meaning, the second-hand market blurred the boundaries of class in ways no law could untangle. For all its pretensions, Tudor fashion was not a closed system, it was a cycle. The nobles flaunted, the servants adapted, and the city merchants monetized it all. Silk sleeves became patched tunics, jewelled collars became market trinkets, and the hierarchy of England was stitched together with second-hand seams. So yes, the aristocrats might have strutted under chandeliers, but the real winners were the servants who got the leftovers, and the fripperers who made a living from aristocratic excess. After all, in a world built on appearances, nothing was more valuable than used grandeur. If your master went broke, at least you got a free doublet. In Tudor England, dressing too well could be hazardous to your health. While the monarchy demanded splendour and magnificence from its courtiers, there was a fine and very fatal line between impressing the crown and offending it. In a society where status was woven into every seam, fashion wasn't just self-expression, it was social dynamite. Some nobles were executed for treason, others for wearing too much gold trim. To understand the danger of overdressing, one must remember that Tudor fashion wasn't merely vanity, it was politics in fabric form. Every ruff, every huge gem, every thread of imported silk broadcast a message of power. And when everyone at court was vying to outshine one another, that message could easily turn from "I'm loyal and elegant" to "I think I'm richer than the Queen." A dangerous miscommunication indeed. Take the notorious case of Anne Boleyn, whose fashion sense was almost as fatal as her ambition. Before she was queen, Anne captivated Henry VIII with her sharp wit and even sharper wardrobe. She dressed in daring French styles, low-cut bodices, delicate lace, and headdresses that scandalized conservative courtiers. Her elegance was intoxicating to the king, but infuriating to everyone else. Her critics claimed her vanity was unseemly. Her supporters said it was strategic. Either way, when the court turned on her, that same taste for luxury became evidence of pride. And pride in Tudor England could get you beheaded faster than a bad marriage proposal. Fashion scandals were a spectator sport at the royal court. Elizabeth I, despite being the ultimate fashion icon, was hypersensitive to anyone who dared outshine her. Courtiers were expected to dazzle, but never to dazzle more than her. One lady-in-waiting made the mistake of wearing a gown so elaborate it drew attention away from the Queen during a banquet. Elizabeth, upon seeing the crowd's murmurs of admiration, reportedly smiled sweetly and then confiscated the gown on the spot. The message was clear. You can wear splendour, but remember who invented it. The problem wasn't just vanity, it was visibility. The court was a pressure cooker of gossip, jealousy, and strategic flattery. Every feathered hat or jewelled girdle was a political statement, and every misstep was ammunition for rumour. An overdressed noble might be accused of affectation, a word that sounds harmless until you realise it meant trying too hard to look important. That could imply ambitions above one's station, and in a world where social hierarchy was sacred, ambition was practically sedition. The sumptuary laws, those ever-present fashion commandments, existed precisely to prevent such disasters. They weren't just moral guidelines, they were social safety rails. By limiting who could wear what, the crown kept people in their visual lanes. Silk, velvet, and cloth of gold were supposed to be confined to the elite, but many ambitious nobles ignored the restrictions, confident that their proximity to power would protect them. Sometimes it didn't. A certain Sir Philip Howard, later the Earl of Arundel, learned this the hard way. Known for his extravagant tastes, Howard paraded through court in outfits dripping with jewels and Italian embroidery. His peers called him the Peacock of Arundel. Unfortunately, his sartorial swagger coincided with political friction. He fell out of favour with Elizabeth, and when he was accused of treason, his wardrobe became part of the evidence. The implication was that he had dressed not as a loyal subject, but as a rival monarch. In Tudor logic, fashion could be treasonous if it looked too self-confident. And then there were the French and Spanish ambassadors, whose foreign fashions sparked endless intrigue. When the French envoy arrived in London wearing silk hose and a doublet encrusted with gems, the English courtiers seethed with envy. Elizabeth's ministers whispered that such gaudy display was an attempt to insult English restraint. Meanwhile, when Spanish envoys arrived clad in austere black velvet, symbolising Catholic piety, rumours spread that English nobles copying their look were secret sympathisers of Rome. In Tudor England, your wardrobe could get you accused of espionage or heresy depending on the fabric. Even colours carried scandalous weight. Yellow, for instance, became politically charged when Elizabeth's sister Mary first died. Traditionally a colour of mourning in Spain, yellow was worn by Elizabeth to signify both grief and triumph, subtle as a cannon blast. Courtiers who followed her example were praised for loyalty. Those who didn't risked being branded as secretly mourning Mary's Catholic regime. One shade out of step, and you might find yourself under suspicion of treason, or worse, bad taste. The problem with a court obsessed with clothing was that it blurred the line between sin and style. Moralists accused nobles of idolatry of the body, claiming their elaborate garments tempted the devil himself. Pamphlets warned that fashion was the gateway to corruption, while preachers thundered that ruffs were the devil's millstones. Even the poor got involved, mocking overdressed nobles in satirical ballads. One popular song from the 1570s jeered, "Her sleeves so wide, her ruff so tall, she cannot kneel to pray at all." But ridicule could easily turn to ruin. Gossip in Tudor England was as lethal as poison. A noble woman wearing too much lace might find herself whispered about as wanton. A courtier sporting a foreign cut might be accused of popish tendencies. Even wearing too much black, supposedly a symbol of dignity, could spark suspicion that one was mourning the wrong person or aligning with Spanish fashion. In a society where everyone was watching, fashion faux pas were political suicide dressed as elegance. Ironically, the monarchs themselves encouraged the very excess they condemned. Henry VIII had decreed laws against excessive finery, then appeared at court wearing garments so heavy with jewels he could barely walk. Elizabeth I scolded her nobles for overindulging in luxury, while owning over 2,000 gowns. The hypocrisy was part of the performance. Royal fashion was propaganda, while everyone else's was potential heresy. The real casualties of fashion scandals, though, were often social rather than physical. A single misjudged outfit could destroy a career. A courtier accused of vanity might be exiled from royal favour, cut off from patronage, and left to rot in obscurity. In Tudor England, exile from court was social death, a fate worse than the Tower, because you were forgotten rather than executed. Yet despite the risks, the obsession continued. Every noble dreamed of catching the Queen's eye for the right reason, even as they feared doing so for the wrong one. The court thrived on its contradictions, demanding splendour but punishing pride, praising elegance but condemning ambition. In the end, Tudor fashion was a tightrope walk over a pit of daggers. To dress was to declare loyalty, but to overdress was to tempt ruin. It wasn't enough to look magnificent. You had to look magnificent politely. Because in the Tudor world, a ruff could strangle your career as easily as your neck. And while some nobles were executed for treason, others might as well have been executed for wearing too much gold trim. For decades, Tudor England had been the catwalk of Europe, an empire of velvet, lace, and financial delusion. Nobles strutted like peacocks through gilded halls, merchants grew rich selling imported silks, and servants gleefully inherited the cast-offs of the mighty. But by the late 1500s, the music had stopped, the treasuries were empty, and the nation was suffering the hangover of a century-long shopping spree. When your wardrobe's worth more than your castle, the math starts to hurt. The Tudor dream of glory, grandeur, and gold thread embroidery had one fatal flaw. None of it was sustainable. The same nobles who once bankrupted themselves on ruffs and codpieces were now mortgaging their estates just to keep their sleeves puffed. Meanwhile, the monarchy, having encouraged this fashionable arms race as proof of England's splendour, was quietly counting its own debts. Even Queen Elizabeth I, the master of image management, left behind an empty treasury and mountains of unpaid bills. The realm had been living on style credit. Let's start with the numbers, because they're as brutal as a tailor's needle in the ribs. Maintaining a noble household in Tudor England could cost upwards of £1,000 per year. A staggering sum when even wealthy merchants earned half that. Yet the clothing expenses alone could eat through entire estates. One countess reportedly spent £200 in a single year just on ribbons and lace. The Earl of Oxford, one of Elizabeth's most flamboyant courtiers, was said to owe money to nearly every tailor in London. He even sold ancestral lands to pay for new outfits, proof that you can't wear a castle, but you can definitely lose one to fashion. The crown didn't help. Both Henry VIII and Elizabeth I demanded opulent displays from their courtiers. Appearances were national propaganda. Luxury proved loyalty. But the more the court glittered, the more the economy dimmed. Money that could have been invested in trade, farming, or infrastructure vanished into silk and starch. The textile industry thrived, yes, but the aristocracy was quietly eating itself alive. As noble fortunes crumbled, estates began changing hands at a record pace. Landed families that had stood for centuries sold their properties to pay debts. Merchant bankers, those shrewd men who once loaned gold for gowns, started buying up manors and titles. The social order inverted like a turned glove. Nobles became poor, and the new money class became landed. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, many great houses were half abandoned, their once grand halls echoing with the ghosts of unpaid servants and unpaid bills. England's countryside glittered less, its cities more. Even the royal wardrobe faced austerity. Elizabeth, ever the master illusionist, ordered her old gowns refurbished and retrimmed instead of commissioning new ones. Her ladies-in-waiting were instructed to recycle fabrics and re-dye faded silks. This wasn't environmentalism, it was desperation dressed as prudence. The Queen, who once dazzled Europe, now had her tailors patch the same gowns for years, relying on clever lighting and stiff collars to disguise the repetition. She was, in essence, the first monarch to master fashion on a budget. But the cracks weren't just financial, they were moral. The late 16th century saw a growing backlash against the extravagance of the Tudor elite. Preachers thundered that vanity had cursed the nation, draining its virtue and its coin. Pamphlets warned that luxury invited divine punishment. The Puritans, England's new moral watchdogs, took special delight in condemning the painted Jezebels and gaudy gallants of court life. They saw every jewelled ruff as evidence of spiritual decay and every slashed doublet as a gateway to hell. The backlash wasn't entirely misplaced. By 1600, inflation had made even basic necessities expensive. The cost of food, rent, and clothing doubled within a generation. While nobles flaunted their imported velvets, labourers starved. To many observers, the sight of gold-trimmed courtiers strolling past beggars symbolised everything wrong with Tudor society. The fashion that once represented national pride now looked like moral failure stitched in silk. Even within the upper classes, the mood shifted. Excess began to feel embarrassing. Letters from the 1590s show nobles lamenting their financial ruin and renouncing fashion in favour of modesty, though modesty in Tudor terms still meant pearls and velvet, just fewer of them. Some began dressing in darker, plainer colours, citing piety as the reason, but secretly grateful for the cost savings. The flamboyant peacock age was giving way to the sober crow. Elizabeth herself wasn't blind to the change. She may have adored her gowns, but she also understood optics. As the 1590s brought famine, war, and economic strain, she scaled back her public displays of luxury. Gone were the endless tournaments and masks dripping with gold thread. In their place came measured pageantry designed to project stability rather than splendour. The Queen's famous phrase, "We princes are set on stages," took on new meaning. She was still acting, but the script had changed. Meanwhile, the once lavish tailoring industry suffered its own come-down. As noble clients defaulted on payments, workshops closed and apprentices dispersed. Some tailors turned to the booming second-hand market, others fled London for provincial towns, seeking steady income from practical folk who only needed a good wool cloak. The days of sewing jewels onto sleeves for unpaid noblemen were over. The fripperers, however, thrived. There was suddenly a lot of second-hand silk to go around. The decline of Tudor fashion wasn't an overnight collapse. It was a slow, embarrassing unravelling. What began as national theatre turned into economic farce. By the early 1600s, when the Stuart dynasty replaced the Tudors, England's nobles were still trying to look wealthy but doing it with last decade's fabric. The court of James III inherited both the throne and the overdraft. The grandeur of the Tudors survived only in portraits, painted fantasies of wealth that had already been pawned, and perhaps that's the final irony. The very clothes that bankrupted a generation are the ones that preserved their image for eternity. In paintings they remain resplendent, ruffed, jewelled and spotless. The debts, the lawsuits, the repossessions, they don't show up in oil and pigment. History remembers the shine, not the receipts. Yet beneath the layers of brocade and gold, the truth was clear. The Tudor obsession with appearance had consumed itself. Nobility was no longer measured by lineage or honour, but by who could afford to pretend longest. When the pretense collapsed, all that remained was fabric, and a nation learning that you can't build an empire on fashion credit. So when the tailors stopped stitching and the creditors came knocking, the peacocks of England discovered the cruel arithmetic of vanity. Silk fades, velvet rots, gold tarnishes, and debt, like a good ruff, never goes out of style. When your wardrobe's worth more than your castle, the math starts to hurt. The Tudor age may have ended with empty treasuries and threadbare nobles, but it left behind something far more enduring than silk or gold. It created the blueprint for British style itself. The obsession with image, hierarchy, and public display that defined Tudor fashion would ripple through centuries of culture, shaping everything from Georgian tailoring to the glossy catwalks of London Fashion Week. The Tudors walked so London Fashion Week could strut. To understand the legacy, you have to appreciate what the Tudors actually achieved. They turned fashion into national identity. Before them, England was sartorially behind the times, a land of practical wool and muddy boots compared to the elegance of France or Italy. But by the late 1500s, thanks to the relentless spectacle of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, England had reinvented itself as a stage where clothing wasn't just worn, it was performed. Every thread became propaganda, every colour a declaration of belonging to a powerful, sophisticated kingdom. The first major legacy was royal image making. The Tudors didn't have social media, but they understood branding better than most modern influencers. Henry VIII's portraits, particularly those by Hans Holbein, are the original power photo shoots. His famously broad stance, jewelled garments and armour-like doublets weren't just fashion, they were statecraft. He projected dominance through fabric, posture and sheer textile intimidation. That visual legacy defined the image of British monarchy for centuries to come. When later kings like Charles I or George IV posed in gilded uniforms or coronation robes, they were channeling Henry's playbook: look rich, look powerful, look untouchable. Elizabeth I took this even further. Her wardrobe became a political instrument, thousands of gowns carefully designed to project divine authority and virgin purity. Pearls representing chastity, suns and moons symbolizing cosmic power, eyes and ears embroidered into her sleeves, warning courtiers she saw and heard all. The Queen's image was so carefully curated that she essentially became England's first fashion brand, Elizabeth Regina TM. Even after her death, that image endured. Her portraits, like Her Reign, set a national tone of elegance laced with discipline, spectacle balanced by control. In short, the Tudors invented the concept of fashion as identity politics. Their second great contribution was the integration of fashion and class performance. Tudor England created a culture in which clothing didn't just signal wealth, it defined social mobility. The constant struggle of courtiers to keep up with royal trends laid the groundwork for Britain's later obsession with etiquette, uniformity and refinement. The powdered wigs of the 18th century, the starched collars of the Victorians, even the proper English suit of Savile Row, all trace their lineage back to Tudor hierarchy in fabric form. Dressing well became moralised, not just a sign of success, but of discipline, civility and national pride. The Tudor obsession with textiles also forged Britain's future as a global trade empire. Those endless demands for silk, velvet, and lace helped build the merchant infrastructure that later powered the East India Company and the expansion of English commerce. What began as nobles bankrupting themselves for Italian brocade evolved into a worldwide system of trade and production. It's a dark irony that an age obsessed with appearance helped create an empire of materialism, an empire that would, centuries later, ship English wool and Indian cotton in opposite directions in the name of fashion. And then there's the artistry. Tudor fashion inspired the birth of English craftsmanship, a legacy that still defines British luxury today. Tailors, embroiderers and milliners became respected artisans during the 16th century. They were no longer anonymous servants but creators of national prestige. By the Georgian and Regency eras, their descendants were the masters of London's West End, making custom garments for royalty and nobility alike. The attention to cut, structure and restraint that defines British tailoring, the precise lines of a Savile Row suit, descends directly from Tudor tailoring discipline. What began with bombasted doublets evolved into measured elegance. The Tudors also left behind the concept of fashion as storytelling. Portraits from the period weren't mere likenesses, they were manifestos in silk and oil. When Elizabeth posed in her rainbow portrait with her gown covered in eyes and ears, she wasn't showing off her wardrobe, she was narrating her reign through symbols. Modern Britain never lost that instinct. From Queen Victoria's black mourning dress, turning personal grief into a cultural fashion movement, to punk rebellion in the 1970s, safety pins replacing pearls but the message just as defiant, every era of British fashion has used clothing as declaration. The Tudors taught the nation that clothes speak. Even the moral backlash against Tudor extravagance became part of British fashion DNA. The Puritan distaste for vanity morphed into the later Protestant aesthetic of modest refinement, a preference for clean lines, muted tones, and understated luxury. This paradox between flamboyance and restraint has defined British style ever since. The same country that produced Henry VIII's gold-embroidered monstrosities would centuries later produce the elegant simplicity of the trench coat and the tweed suit. It's as though Britain internalised the Tudor lesson. Spectacle is fine, but control is classier. Modern luxury brands still owe a debt to Tudor audacity. The marketing techniques that drive Burberry, Alexander McQueen or Vivienne Westwood, using heritage, spectacle and shock in equal measure, are descendants of the Tudor playbook. Henry VIII would have loved McQueen's theatrical tailoring. Elizabeth would have understood Westwood's defiant pageantry. Even the royal family's meticulous dress codes, from coronation robes to wedding gowns, still echo Tudor pageantry. The monarchy remains a living fashion institution. And of course, the portrait tradition endures. Those Renaissance depictions of monarchs standing stiffly in gleaming attire have evolved into modern photo ops, royal weddings, coronations, and charity galas where clothing remains a message of continuity, duty, and national image. The Tudors may not have invented the photo call, but they certainly perfected the pose. Their legacy, then, isn't just about fabric, it's about philosophy. The Tudors taught Britain that fashion isn't frivolous, it's a form of storytelling, power, and identity. They proved that style could rule empires, shape economies, and outlive dynasties. Long after their ruffs turned to dust, the instinct to dress for influence remained stitched into the national psyche. Today, when London Fashion Week turns runways into global spectacles, it's not just commerce, it's history replaying itself. The city that once measured greatness in lace collars now measures it in couture collections. The obsession, the performance, the politics, it's all pure Tudor theatre, modernised and monetised. The Tudors taught England how to look magnificent even when broke, how to weaponise beauty, and how to turn vanity into legacy. Their gold-threaded dreams still shimmer faintly in every British runway and royal portrait. Because centuries later, Britain still walks the stage they built, head held high, ruff replaced by confidence, and every step echoing that eternal truth. The Tudors walked so London Fashion Week could strut.